had planned the hike for weeks, a solo trip deep into the wilderness, away from people, noise, and everything else that made life feel so heavy. I wanted the quiet, the solitude, just me and the trail, pushing forward under the weight of my pack. It was supposed to be simple. The trail wasn't well known. That was part of the appeal. It was remote, buried deep in the mountains, and the route I planned would take me far from any other hikers. No crowds, no distractions, just miles of untouched land. I had the right gear, the experience, and a printed map tucked in my pack, even though I had GPS. Everything was accounted for. The first day was perfect. The air was crisp, the smell of pine thick in the air. I followed the trail as it weaved through the trees, winding higher into the mountains. The elevation gain was slow but steady. I took my time, stopping to rest and drink water when I needed. I didn't rush. This was supposed to be an escape, a break from the fast pace of life. By late afternoon, I reached my planned campsite, a small clearing near a stream, just big enough for my tent and a fire pit. I set up my tent, boiled water for my dehydrated meal, and sat against a rock as I ate. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows through the trees. It was peaceful. I should have noticed it then. The stillness. No birds, no rustling leaves from small animals moving through the brush. Just silence. I chalked it up to the altitude. Maybe I was higher than I thought. The first night was uneventful, but I woke up feeling off. Not sick, not tired, just off. Like I had forgotten something important. I shook it off, packed up camp, and continued on. The trail became steeper, winding up a ridge before dipping back down into a valley. I was making good time, but that feeling stuck with me. The deeper I hiked, the stronger it got. Like I wasn't supposed to be there. I pushed it down, focusing on the trail, my breathing, the weight of my pack. But by midday, I noticed something strange. There were no signs of wildlife at all. No birds overhead, no chipmunks darting between rocks, no distant sound of deer moving through the trees. Just silence. Then I saw the first one, a deer skull, picked clean, sitting right in the middle of the trail. Not off to the side, not half buried in the dirt. Right in the center, as if it had been placed there. The antlers were still attached, curling out like twisted branches. I stopped, stared. My stomach tightened. I had seen animal remains before, but this was different. Too clean, too deliberate. I moved past it, shaking off the unease. Kept walking. Another mile, maybe two, and then I saw the second one. Another skull. Same placement, right in the center of the trail. This one was smaller, maybe a coyote? The bones were white, sun-bleached, untouched by scavengers. The feeling in my gut turned to ice. I pulled out my GPS, checked my location. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. No lost turns, no wrong paths. But something was wrong. I should have turned back then. But I didn't. The trail led me into a dense patch of trees, the kind where the branches grow so close together they block out the sky. It was dark, the air heavy. The silence pressed against me. Then I smelled it. Rot. It was faint at first, barely there. But as I moved forward, it thickened. The sour, putrid stench of something long dead. I covered my nose with my sleeve. It didn't help. The smell clung to my throat, my lungs. Then I saw them, piles of bones. Not just one, not just two, dozens. Scattered through the trees, some stacked, some half buried in the dirt. Skulls, rib cages, femurs. Some from deer, others smaller. One looked human. I stopped breathing. My body went cold. I wasn't alone. I turned, started walking back the way I came. Not running, just moving fast, keeping my breath steady. I needed to get out of that section of trees, get back to open ground. Then I heard it, branches snapping. Behind me, not an animal, not the wind. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate. I didn't look back. I walked faster, pushing through the brush, stepping over rocks and roots. My pack felt too heavy, like it was slowing me down. The footsteps stayed behind me, close, too close. The trees thinned. I saw the trail ahead, bathed in weak afternoon light. I stepped out of the dense woods and onto the open path. The footsteps stopped. I turned. Nothing. Just trees. Dark, quiet, unmoving. I kept going. I hiked until the sun started to set, putting as much distance between me and that place as I could. I didn't stop to eat. Didn't stop for water. Just moved. The feeling didn't leave. I knew, deep down, that I wasn't safe. Not yet. That night, I didn't set up camp. I found a flat patch of ground just off the trail and sat with my back to a tree, my headlamp in my lap. I wasn't going to sleep. Hours passed. The woods stayed silent. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. Closer this time. Slow. Careful. Like they knew I was listening. I gripped my knife. My headlamp was off. I didn't want to give away my position. I held my breath. Then the worst part. Breathing. Not mine. Not an animal's. Just beyond the trees. Deep and steady. Inhale. Exhale. Too close. I didn't move. Didn't blink. I sat there, heart pounding so hard I thought it would give me away. Then nothing. Silence. I stayed like that until dawn. Only when the sun rose did I finally stand, my legs numb and stiff. I didn't bother eating, didn't bother checking the map. I just walked, fast, determined. By midday, I reached the edge of the forest. My car was still there, waiting at the trailhead. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I was inside, the doors locked, the engine on. I drove. I don't know what was out there. I don't want to know, but I'll never go back. Some places aren't meant to be found. I had been hiking alone for years. It was my way of clearing my head, pushing myself, and feeling something real. That weekend, I picked a trail deep in the mountains, one I hadn't done before. It was remote, long, and steep, just the way I liked it. The drive to the trailhead was rough. The road was mostly gravel, cutting through dense trees that blocked out the sky. My car bumped along for miles before I finally reached the small parking area. No other cars. Perfect. I liked it that way. The more isolated, the better. I got out, stretched, and adjusted my pack. The air was crisp, the kind that bit at your lungs when you breathed too deep. The sky was clear. It was going to be a good hike. The first few miles were nothing special. Just a steady climb through the forest, my boots crunching over dry leaves. Birds chirped in the distance. Every now and then, a squirrel would dart across the path. The forest felt alive, but in a quiet way. Peaceful. After about 3 hours, I reached a ridgeline. The view stretched for miles, layers of mountains stacked on top of each other, fading into the horizon. I took a break, drank some water, and kept moving. I wanted to make it to a lake I had read about. A few more hours and I'd set up camp there for the night. As I descended into the valley, the feeling started. I don't know how to explain it. It wasn't fear. Not yet. Just a sense that something was off. The forest was too quiet. The birds were gone. The wind had stopped. It was like the whole place was holding its breath. I kept walking, trying to shake the feeling, but it only got worse. My skin prickled. My stomach tightened. I checked my map, my GPS, everything was fine. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Then I saw the footprints. They weren't mine. They were fresh, heading the same direction I was going. Barefoot. Human. I stopped. My heart pounded. There was no reason for anyone to be out here without shoes. The nearest town was over 40 miles away. The trail wasn't popular, and I hadn't seen a single car at the trailhead. I crouched down and looked closer. The prints were deep. Whoever made them was heavy. They weren't spaced right for a normal walk either. Too long in some places, too close in others, like the person had been dragging one foot. I stood up and scanned the trees. Nothing. I kept going. Slower now. My senses sharp. Every sound felt too loud. Every movement in the trees made my pulse jump. The footprints continued, always ahead of me. I thought about turning back, but I was already deep in. The lake wasn't far. I could make it there, set up camp, and figure things out in the morning. As the sun started to drop, the trees grew denser. The trail narrowed. I felt closed in. That's when I noticed something else. The footprints had stopped, not like they had turned off the trail. They just ended, right in the middle of the path. No sign of where the person went. I looked around, my breath coming faster. No broken branches, no disturbances in the leaves. It was like whoever made them had just vanished. A sharp crack echoed through the trees. I spun around. Nothing. The silence pressed in. I was being watched. I knew it. I could feel it like an itch I couldn't scratch. My whole body screamed at me to run, but I didn't. Running meant panic. Panic meant mistakes. I forced myself forward, step by step. My fingers tightened around the straps of my pack. The lake was just ahead. I could see the water through the trees, dark and still. I pushed through the final stretch and stepped onto the shore. Relief flooded through me. The open space felt safer. I set up my tent quickly, my hands shaking. I built a fire larger than usual. The light helped, but the feeling didn't go away. I ate without tasting my food, my back to the water, my eyes scanning the trees. Night fell. The forest became a wall of black. Then the sounds started. Not normal forest sounds. Not rustling leaves or distant animal calls. This was something else. A low, uneven breathing. Not mine. Close. Too close. I didn't move. My fire crackled. The breathing stopped. Then, a footstep. Not an animal. Too heavy. Deliberate. I grabbed my knife. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. Another step. Closer. I turned slowly, firelight flickering against the trees. Nothing. Then, just beyond the reach of the light, something shifted. I saw a shape. Person? No, wrong. Too tall. Too thin. The proportions were off. It didn't move right. I blinked. It was gone. The fire popped, sending a burst of sparks into the air. My hands were slick with sweat. I swallowed hard and forced myself to stay put. If I ran, I'd be running blind into the trees. That was worse. Hours passed. The sounds never came back, but the feeling did. The overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone. I didn't sleep. As soon as the sky lightened, I packed up and left. I moved fast. My legs ached. My lungs burned. I didn't stop. I didn't drink. I didn't look back. When I finally reached my car, I threw my pack inside and locked the doors. My hands trembled as I started the engine. The road out felt longer than before. I didn't relax until I was miles away, back on paved roads, back near people, back where the world felt real again. I don't know what I saw. I don't know what was out there, but I know I'm never hiking alone again. I was alone in the woods, hiking a trail that barely existed anymore. It was one of those places you found by accident, a thin line on an old map, forgotten by everyone except the trees and the wind. I had been walking for hours, my backpack heavy with supplies, my boots already caked in dried mud from the last creek crossing. There was no cell signal out here, no comforting blue dot on a screen to tell me where I was. Just the trail, if you could call it that, and the feeling that I had ventured somewhere I shouldn't have. The air was still, thick with the damp smell of rotting leaves and old wood. My footsteps were the only sound, a steady crunch on the forest floor. I liked hiking alone, but this felt different. The deeper I went, the more I realized how silent it was. No birds, no insects, just the occasional creak of a tree shifting in place. I kept walking, trying to shake the unease crawling up my spine. Then I found the first sign of trouble. A boot print, fresh in the mud. It wasn't mine. It was deep, heavier than my own, and pointed in the same direction I was going. Someone else had come this way recently. I didn't know why that bothered me so much, but it did. The print looked rushed, like whoever left it had been moving fast. I tried to push the thought away. People hiked all the time. Maybe I'd run into them up ahead. Maybe they were just as lost as I was starting to feel. Another hour passed, and the forest closed in tighter. The trees grew taller, their thick trunks crowding together, making the path even harder to follow. I had to step over fallen logs, push aside tangled branches. I kept checking behind me, making sure the way back was still there. That's when I saw the second boot print. This one was different. It was deeper, like whoever made it had stopped suddenly, shifted their weight. Like they had been listening, watching. A cold sweat broke out on my back. I wasn't alone. I kept walking, faster now, my breath tight in my chest. The trail twisted ahead, disappearing behind a rocky outcrop. My gut told me to turn back, but my legs kept moving forward. Then I saw it. A backpack, just sitting there, half unzipped, leaning against a mossy boulder. It was old, dirty, the fabric torn in places. A water bottle lay next to it, tipped over and empty. I stepped closer, my skin crawling. It had been here for a while. The straps were frayed, the zippers rusted. But the weirdest thing, the ground around it was disturbed, like someone had been pacing, like someone had been standing here, waiting. I reached out, hesitated, then pulled the top open. Inside, there were clothes, damp and mildewed, a flashlight with dead batteries, a folded-up map, stained with something dark. I swallowed hard, my fingers trembling as I turned it over. The map showed the area I was in, but something was off. There were marks on it, lines scratched into the paper, leading off the trail into the trees. And next to those lines, a single word was scrawled over and over in shaky handwriting. Help. My stomach turned. This wasn't just some abandoned gear. Someone had been here, someone who needed help, and now they were gone. I spun around, scanning the trees, my heartbeat slamming against my ribs. The wind picked up, rattling the branches. For the first time all day, I heard a sound that wasn't my own. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. I wasn't alone, and whoever was out there wasn't lost. They had been waiting, watching. I yanked my pack over my shoulders and started back the way I came, moving fast, too fast. My foot caught on a root, and I went down hard, the impact jolting up my arms. I scrambled up, heart pounding, dirt in my mouth. I could hear them now, moving closer, picking up speed. I didn't look back. I ran. The trail was barely visible in the fading light, the trees shifting around me like shadows. I could hear my own breath, ragged and desperate. The footsteps behind me weren't just following anymore. They were chasing. I pushed myself harder, my legs burning. The path twisted, and suddenly, I was out of the trees, stumbling into a clearing. And then I saw it. A cabin, old and weathered, hidden in the middle of nowhere. There was no time to think. I ran straight for it, my hands slamming against the door. It swung open with a groan, and I threw myself inside, shoving it shut behind me. The footsteps stopped. Silence pressed against the walls. My whole body was shaking. The cabin was empty. Dust covered every surface. Old furniture sat untouched, a thick smell of mildew in the air. There was no sign of recent life, but the door had been unlocked. My mind raced. Was this where they had been staying? The person who left that map? The one who needed help? Then, from outside, I heard it. A slow, deliberate knock on the door. I didn't move. My breath hitched, my body frozen. The knock came again, harder this time. Whoever was out there wasn't leaving. I reached for the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a rusted fire poker leaning against the wall. My fingers closed around it just as the knocking stopped. And then the door handle turned. I backed up, my grip tightening, my heartbeat a wild drum in my ears. The door creaked as it slowly pushed open, revealing the darkness outside. The trees stood still, the clearing empty. No one was there, but I knew they were watching. I could feel it. I didn't wait to find out what they wanted. I bolted, running through the trees, branches slashing at my arms. I didn't stop, not until I found my car parked miles away, right where I left it. I jumped in, locked the doors, and sped down the road without looking back. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I do know one thing. Some places aren't meant to be found, and some people never make it back. I did, barely. I don't know why I decided to hike alone that day. Maybe it was the stress, the need to clear my head, or just a dumb sense of confidence. I'd done plenty of hikes before, but this one was different. Longer, more remote. It was the kind of trail people avoided unless they were serious about it. The morning air was crisp, the kind that makes you feel alive. I parked my car at the trailhead, slung my pack over my shoulders, and checked my gear one last time. Water, snacks, knife, first aid kit. The basics. I had a map too, even though I planned to rely mostly on my phone's GPS. The trail stretched ahead, disappearing into the trees, and I took my first steps without hesitation. For the first couple of hours, it was peaceful. The trail was narrow, winding through thick forest with only the occasional clearing where the sun broke through. Birds chirped, squirrels rustled in the underbrush, and everything felt calm. I made good time, enjoying the solitude, the steady rhythm of my steps. I passed a small creek, took a moment to refill my bottle with filtered water, and kept going. Around noon, I reached a fork in the trail. The main path curved gently to the left, the one I'd planned to follow. But there was another, narrower path to the right, barely visible through the undergrowth. It wasn't on the map. I stood there for a moment, considering. Curiosity got the better of me. I figured it would reconnect with the main trail eventually, maybe offer a better view. I turned onto it. It was different immediately. The air felt heavier, the forest denser. The ground was uneven, roots twisting up like grasping fingers. I moved carefully, making sure I had solid footing. After maybe half a mile, I realized the trail wasn't as much of a trail as I thought. It was fading, overgrown, like no one had used it in years. But by then, I was already committed. I figured if I just kept going straight, I'd hit the main path again. Then I saw the first sign that something was wrong. A shoe. A single, tattered hiking boot half buried in the dirt. It was old, weathered. Maybe someone had lost it years ago, but there was something about it that made me uneasy. I took a picture, planning to check online later to see if it matched any missing person reports. A few minutes later, I saw something else. A torn piece of fabric caught on a low-hanging branch. Faded blue, the edges frayed. I stopped, looking around. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. No wind, no birds. Just the sound of my own breathing. I told myself it was nothing, kept moving. But then I saw the clearing. It wasn't big, maybe 20 feet across, ringed by tall trees. In the center, there was a pile of bones. Not animal bones. I knew that instantly. They were too long, too human. Some were broken, jagged at the edges like they'd been snapped. I felt my stomach turn. I took a step back, my boot crunching on something. Another bone. I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, get out of there. But I forced myself to stay calm. If this was real, if these were human remains, I needed to report it. I pulled out my phone, my hands shaking, and tried to call 911. No signal. Of course. I turned, ready to retrace my steps, when I noticed something else. Footprints. Not mine. Fresh in the dirt. Someone else had been here recently, and they weren't wearing boots. The prints were bare feet. I started walking fast, trying to be quiet, but not caring if I was loud. I needed to get back to the main trail. My mind raced. Who else was out here? Had they seen me? Were they watching me now? Every shadow between the trees looked like a person. Every snapped twig made my heart pound harder. Then I heard it. A rustling. Close. Too close. I turned my head just enough to see movement out of the corner of my eye. A figure half hidden behind a tree. Tall, thin. Watching me. I didn't stop to get a better look. I ran. Branches whipped against my face, my arms. I nearly tripped over a root, catching myself at the last second. I could hear them behind me, moving fast, too fast. I didn't look back. I just ran. My lungs burned. My legs screamed, but I didn't stop. Then suddenly I was back on the main trail. I nearly collapsed, gasping for breath. The forest around me felt normal again, lighter. I turned back, expecting to see whoever, or whatever, had been chasing me. Nothing, just trees, still and quiet. I forced myself to keep moving, I didn't stop again until I reached my car. I locked the doors, started the engine with shaking hands, and sped out of there, barely checking the road. I reported what I found as soon as I got home. The police took me seriously at first. They sent a search team out. They found the clearing, the bones. But they told me later that they weren't human. Animal remains, probably scattered by scavengers. I know what I saw. I know those were human bones. I know I wasn't alone out there. And I know I'll never go back. I had been planning this solo hike for months. The route was deep in the backcountry, miles from any trailhead, the kind of place where you wouldn't see another person for days. It was exactly what I wanted. Just me, the wilderness, and the silence. I packed light but smart. My tent, food, a water filter, my GPS, and a small emergency beacon in case something went wrong. I had experience hiking alone, but this trip would push my limits. 5 days, 40 miles, no marked trails. The first 2 days went smoothly. The weather held up, the sun warm but not brutal, the nights crisp but not freezing. I made good time, following a ridgeline that overlooked a deep valley. The isolation was exactly what I had hoped for. There were no people, no artificial sounds. Just the wind in the trees and the occasional rustle of an animal in the underbrush. On the 3rd day, things changed. It started with a wrong turn. I had been following an old game trail, something barely visible under layers of leaves and pine needles, but at some point it disappeared. My GPS showed me roughly where I was, but when I tried to cut back toward my intended route, I found myself in dense forest. The trees packed so tightly together that I had to push through branches like a rat in a maze. I checked my map, reoriented, and pushed on, but the terrain wasn't matching what I expected. Slopes were steeper, the ground rockier. I had drifted off course, and I knew that in places like this, even a mile in the wrong direction could mean hours of backtracking. The real trouble started when I stumbled. I was making my way down a steep embankment, my boots sliding slightly on loose dirt. I reached for a tree to steady myself, but the branch snapped, and I fell. My foot twisted sharply under me, sending a sharp pain shooting up my leg. I landed hard on my side. The wind knocked out of me. For a few moments, I just lay there, staring at the canopy above, my brain catching up with the pain radiating from my ankle. When I tried to stand, my ankle gave out. I cursed, sat back down, and pulled off my boot. My ankle was already swelling. Not broken, I told myself, but bad enough. I dug into my pack for an elastic wrap, bound it as tightly as I could, and tested my weight again. I could stand, but walking would be slow and painful. I checked my GPS again. I was farther from my planned route than I had thought. No trails nearby. No easy way back up the ridge I had come from. The only real option was to keep moving forward and hope I intersected my route again further down. The day wore on, the pain in my ankle becoming a constant throb. My pace was agonizingly slow. The forest around me felt different now. Less like a place of peace, more like something indifferent, even hostile. The trees loomed taller, their trunks twisted and gnarled. The undergrowth was thick and unyielding. More than once, I had to stop and cut through vines with my knife, something I had never had to do before in these woods. As the sun dipped lower, I found a small clearing and decided to make camp. I set up my tent, forced down some food, and tried to elevate my ankle. It had swelled to almost twice its size, the skin turning dark. I took some painkillers from my first aid kit, knowing I had to be careful not to run out too soon. Then I heard it, a sound, far off, barely more than a whisper through the trees. A rhythmic rustling, like something moving in the underbrush. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but the noise didn't fade or retreat like it usually would. It stayed, circling just beyond the reach of my headlamp. I sat up, listening, heart pounding. I had camped alone many times before, heard coyotes howling in the night, heard the snap of twigs as creatures moved in the dark. But this was different. It was deliberate. I gripped my knife, the only weapon I had, and waited. Eventually, the noise stopped, but sleep didn't come easy. By morning, I told myself I had imagined it. Lack of sleep and the stress of my injury were playing tricks on my mind. I packed up and limped forward, determined to find my way back to my route. The forest felt denser, the air heavier. The pain in my ankle worsened. Every few hours, I had to stop and rest, but each time I did, I felt a creeping unease, as if something was watching me. At midday, I found something that stopped me cold. A boot print, not mine, fresh. I had seen no one out here. No trails, no signs of recent hikers. Yet there it was, deep in the dirt, pointing in the same direction I was headed. I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief because maybe I wasn't alone. Dread because whoever had made that print hadn't called out, hadn't made themselves known. I pressed on, my pace quicker despite the pain. I kept scanning the forest, searching for movement. The trees were still. The only sound was the crunch of my boots against the leaves. By late afternoon, I found something else. A campsite, abandoned. A fire pit, long cold. A tent, unzipped and partially collapsed. A backpack, its contents spilled onto the ground. Clothing, a cooking pot, a flashlight. And blood, a dark stain soaked into the dirt, leading away into the trees. I stood frozen, my mind racing. Animals? An accident? But there was no sign of a struggle, no scattered gear like someone had been dragged. Just that single, terrible streak of blood leading into the woods. I turned and hobbled away as fast as my leg would allow. By nightfall, I was exhausted. My ankle felt like it was on fire. I had to stop, had to rest. I found a patch of relatively open ground, forced myself to eat, and sat with my back against a tree, knife in hand, waiting. The sounds came again, closer this time. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Then silence. Minutes passed. An hour. My eyes burned with exhaustion, but I didn't dare sleep. The forest was a void around me, endless, unknowable. At some point, my body betrayed me, and I drifted into a restless, terrified sleep. When I woke, it was dawn. The forest was still and quiet. I scanned the area. No footprints, no signs of anything unnatural, just my own fear lingering in my chest like a sickness. I forced myself to move. The pain was unbearable, but I didn't stop. By midday, I finally saw something through the trees. A sliver of a marked trail. Civilization. Safety. I stumbled onto it, half crawling, half limping. A few hours later, I found another hiker. They helped me back to the nearest outpost, where I was treated for dehydration and my badly sprained ankle. I didn't tell them everything, just that I had gotten lost, that I had fallen. I never figured out what happened at that campsite, never learned who made that boot print. But I know, without a doubt, I was not alone in those woods. I always liked hiking alone. It gave me time to clear my head, to be away from people, from noise, from everything that felt overwhelming. I wasn't afraid of the woods, of the solitude, of the silence that settled deep the farther I walked. I found it peaceful. That's why I didn't think twice when I picked a trail deep in the national forest, far from any well-traveled paths. It wasn't an official trail, just an old logging road I found on a map. It stretched about 8 miles in, past a few abandoned cabins, and ended at a small lake. I had no plans to camp, just an out-and-back hike before sunset. I left my truck parked at a small pull-off where the dirt road ended and the overgrown trail began. The air was crisp, and the forest smelled damp from the rain the night before. Everything was quiet except for the occasional rustling of leaves as squirrels darted around. I walked at a steady pace, enjoying the way the trees seemed to swallow me up, the outside world disappearing behind me with every step. About 3 miles in, I passed the first of the old cabins. It was nothing more than a pile of collapsed wood, long since abandoned and overtaken by the forest. The second cabin, another mile in, still had some structure to it. The roof sagged, but the walls mostly stood. The door hung open, swinging slightly in the breeze. I didn't go inside. There was no reason to. I kept going, but something felt off. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. It wasn't a sound or a smell, just a feeling that settled in my gut. I brushed it off as paranoia. When you're alone in the woods, your mind plays tricks on you. 5 miles in, I stopped for a break. I sat on a fallen tree, drank some water, and listened. That's when I noticed it. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just dead silence. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was normal, that maybe a predator was nearby. But then I noticed something else. The trees were marked. At first, I thought it was just random scars from fallen branches. But as I looked closer, I saw deep, deliberate cuts in the bark. Some looked fresh. Others were old, nearly healed over. They weren't markings from loggers, these were different. Symbols, straight lines, intersecting shapes. I ran my fingers over one, feeling how deep it was. Something about it made me uneasy. I decided to keep moving, but that feeling in my gut only got worse. The farther I went, the more marks I saw. Some were higher up, carved into thick trunks. Others were lower, near the ground. I tried to ignore them, focusing on the trail ahead, but my pace quickened. The lake was just ahead. I told myself I'd take a quick break there, then turn back. But as I stepped into the clearing, I stopped cold. There was a campsite, a fresh one. The fire pit was still smoldering, ashes glowing faintly. A tent stood nearby, zipped shut. A backpack leaned against a tree. My first thought was that maybe a hunter was camping out here, or another hiker who had come in from a different direction. But then I noticed the tent. It wasn't set up properly, almost like it had been thrown together in a hurry. The backpack was covered in dirt, like it had been there for weeks. I called out. No answer. Something about the scene made my skin crawl. I thought about checking the backpack, maybe looking inside the tent, but a voice in the back of my mind told me not to. Instead, I turned around and started walking back, fast. I was about a mile away from the campsite when I noticed something else. The marks on the trees were different now. They weren't just symbols anymore. They were arrows, pointing in different directions, some towards the trail, others leading off into the woods. Some pointed back the way I came. I picked up my pace. I knew I was on the right trail. I had followed it in, and it was clear enough not to get lost. But the more I walked, the more I felt like something was wrong. The trees all looked the same. The trail felt different, like it was shifting beneath my feet. And then I saw it, a pile of bones, right in the middle of the trail. At first, I thought it was an animal carcass, maybe a deer. But as I stepped closer, I saw that the bones were arranged. Deliberately, some were stacked, others placed in a pattern I didn't understand. They were stripped clean, bleached white. I turned and ran. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. My breath was ragged, my legs burning, but I kept going. The forest blurred around me. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. The only thought in my mind was to get out. I reached the second cabin, barely slowing down as I passed it. I was sure I heard something behind me. Footsteps, movement, but I didn't turn around. By the time I reached my truck, I was shaking. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled onto the road, I glanced back at the trailhead. Something moved in the trees. Just for a second, I drove faster. I never went back, never reported it. I don't know what I saw or what I almost walked into, but I do know one thing. Some places aren't meant to be found. I should have turned back when I saw the first sign. It was early morning when I started the hike. The sky a dull gray, the sun still hidden behind thick clouds. I had planned this solo trip for months, waiting for the perfect weekend to escape the noise of everyday life. A remote trail, far from civilization, seemed like the perfect place to clear my head. I had packed everything: food, water, a first aid kit, extra clothes, a flashlight, and a map just in case my phone lost signal. I thought I was prepared. The first part of the hike was peaceful. The air was crisp, carrying the damp scent of soil and decaying leaves. Birds called out in the distance, hidden in the dense canopy above. The trail was narrow but well-trodden, winding through thick trees. The quiet was comforting at first, the kind that makes you appreciate being alone. About an hour in, I noticed something odd. The trees ahead seemed different, darker, more twisted, their bark peeling in long, jagged strips. The air smelled different too, like something had been left to rot. I shook it off and pressed forward, assuming it was just my imagination. Then I saw it. A torn, dirty jacket hanging from a low branch. It was faded, covered in dried mud, and looked like it had been there for a while. Maybe a hiker lost it, I told myself. But something about the way it hung there, limp and forgotten, sent a chill down my spine. I kept going. The deeper I went, the more uneasy I felt. The trees grew denser, pressing in from both sides, and the air became heavier. I glanced at my phone. No service. I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, but it was growing stronger with every step. I told myself it was just paranoia, the effect of being alone in the woods. Still, my pace quickened. Then I found the footprints. They were fresh. Too fresh. They weren't mine. The trail was damp from last night's rain, and these prints stood out clearly in the mud. They were large, deep, and headed in the same direction I was going. Someone else was out here. I scanned the trees, searching for movement, but saw nothing. My heart was pounding now. I thought about turning back, but I had already come so far. Instead, I moved carefully, my senses on high alert. As I followed the trail, the footprints disappeared. The ground was drier here, harder. I couldn't tell if they had gone off the path or if the trail had simply stopped showing them. Either way, I felt exposed. Then the forest fell silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. I stopped walking and listened. The quiet pressed against my ears, unnatural and heavy. I felt the hair on my arms stand up. Something was wrong. I knew it in my gut. Then a sound, a faint snap, like a twig breaking. I turned quickly, scanning the trees, but nothing moved. I wasn't alone. My breathing was shallow now. I adjusted my pack, trying to keep my hands free. I told myself to stay calm. If I panicked, I'd make mistakes. I needed to keep moving. I walked faster. My eyes darted to every shadow, every tree, every bush. The silence followed me, thick and unrelenting. I had no idea how far I had left to go, but I knew I needed to get out of here. Then I saw it, a makeshift campsite, half hidden off the trail. A tent, torn and collapsed, clothes scattered, an old backpack, its contents spilled onto the ground, and a knife. It was stuck into the trunk of a tree, the blade rusted, the handle wrapped in dirty cloth. Panic surged through me. I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to leave. Then I heard it breathing, slow, deliberate breathing, not mine. I turned sharply. In the distance, something moved between the trees, a shadow, tall and unmoving, watching me. I didn't think. I ran. The trail blurred beneath my feet as I sprinted. My pack slammed against my back. Branches whipped against my arms. My lungs burned. My heart pounded. I didn't look back. Couldn't. I ran until my legs screamed for relief, until I saw the break in the trees ahead. The trailhead. My car. Safety. I didn't stop until I reached it. I fumbled for my keys, throwing myself into the driver's seat and locking the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. Then I looked up. At the edge of the trail, just before the trees swallowed the path, something stood there, watching. I hit the gas, my tires kicking up gravel as I sped away. I don't know who or what I saw out there. I don't want to know. But I do know one thing. I will never hike alone again. The plan was simple. A solo hike through the backcountry. Just me, my pack, and miles of untouched wilderness. I had checked the weather, packed everything I needed, and set off at sunrise. The first few hours were exactly what I had hoped for. Pure solitude, the sound of my boots crunching against dirt, the occasional chirp of birds echoing through the trees. It was perfect. Then, around midday, I took a wrong turn. Shouldn't have been a big deal. I had a map and a compass. My GPS had a signal earlier, but when I pulled it out, the screen showed an empty loading circle. No connection. I wasn't worried, Not yet. I figured I'd backtrack to my last known location and pick up the trail again. That's when I saw the boot prints. They weren't mine. I checked. My prints had a distinct tread pattern, and these were different, wider, deeper. Someone had passed through recently. The weird thing was, they didn't seem to be going in any clear direction. Some pointed forward, some backward, some at odd angles, like whoever made them had been pacing or turning around a lot. It was unsettling, but not enough to stop me. I pushed on, moving in the direction I thought would reconnect me to my original path. The woods stretched endlessly in every direction, tall trees swallowing the sky. The deeper I went, the less I could hear. No birds, no wind, just the dull sound of my own breath. A couple of hours passed. I still hadn't found the trail. The sun was lower now, its light filtering through the branches in long, golden shafts. I checked my map again, but without a proper landmark, it was useless. My stomach twisted. I wasn't just lost, I was turned around. Everything looked the same, and I couldn't tell which way was which anymore. That's when I found the first pile of bones. They were small, maybe a rabbit or a squirrel, picked clean, brittle. At first, I thought it was just nature doing its thing, but then I saw another pile 10 feet away, then another, each one stripped down to nothing, arranged in a way that didn't feel random. A cold prickle ran down my spine. Someone or something had left them like that. I told myself it was just paranoia, that I needed to keep moving. I forced my legs to keep walking even though every instinct screamed at me to stop. Then I smelled it, rot, thick and wet, like meat left in the sun too long. It hit me all at once, making my stomach lurch. I turned a corner and nearly stepped into something worse than the bones. Tent, torn, stained dark. Someone had been living here recently, but it wasn't just abandoned. It had been ripped apart, sleeping bags shredded, supplies scattered, everything coated in that same rancid smell. My chest tightened as I stepped closer, scanning for anything, anyone. The backpack was still there. That was the part that really got me. If someone had left in a hurry, they wouldn't have left that behind. I crouched, hesitating before reaching for it. My fingers brushed the fabric, and that's when I saw the marks on the ground. Deep drag marks leading away from the tent. My throat closed. Every hair on my body stood up. I turned in the direction they led, my eyes following the disturbed earth until it vanished into the thick undergrowth. My hands shook as I stepped back. Something terrible had happened here. I forced myself to breathe. I had to move. I had to get out. I turned in the opposite direction, walking faster now, my steps crunching loud against the leaves. Every sound felt amplified. Every shadow stretched too long. The feeling in my gut only got worse. Then I saw the second set of footprints. Not the boot prints from before. These were barefoot. Deep impressions in the dirt. Longer than normal, the toes spread wide. They weren't following a path. They were following me. I ran. I don't know how far or how long. The trees blurred past. My lungs burned. My heart pounded against my ribs. I kept moving until my legs gave out, collapsing against the base of a massive tree. My fingers dug into the earth as I gasped for breath, my ears straining for any sound behind me. Nothing. For a long time, I sat there, forcing my breathing to slow, trying to think. I needed a plan. Night was coming, and I couldn't stay put. I had no idea how far I had run, how deep I was now. The logical part of me knew I had to get my bearings, but the other part, the one that had seen those footprints, knew I wasn't alone out here. I stood up on shaking legs, forcing myself forward. The light was almost gone now, the sky dimming to purple. I needed to find shelter, somewhere safe. I walked for what felt like hours, my mind racing, my ears tuned to every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves. Then, in the dying light, I saw something that made my stomach drop. My own boot prints, the ones I had made earlier that day. I had been walking in circles. A deep, sinking dread filled me as I realized what that meant. Whatever was out here, whatever had left those footprints, knew exactly what it was doing. It had led me right back to where I started. I turned slowly, my breath coming in short gasps, my body frozen in place. The trees loomed, their dark shapes pressing in. My eyes scanned the shadows, heart hammering so hard it hurt. Then, somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped. I didn't wait. I ran. Again. This time, I didn't stop. I don't know how I made it out. I don't remember how far I went or how long I ran. But eventually, the trees thinned, the darkness broke, and I saw headlights. A road. Civilization. Safety. I stumbled out, waving my arms, nearly collapsing in front of an old pickup truck. The driver, a man in his 60s with a weathered face, jumped out, shouting something I couldn't process. He grabbed my shoulders, shaking me, asking if I was okay. I could barely speak. I just nodded, gasping, shaking. He drove me to the nearest ranger station. I told them I got lost. I didn't mention the footprints, or the tent, or the bones. They found my abandoned campsite the next day. Everything's still there, exactly how I left it. They never found the other tent. I had been hiking alone for years. It was something I loved, being out in the wilderness with nothing but the sound of my own footsteps and the rustling of leaves in the wind. There was something about the isolation that felt comforting. But after what happened last fall, I don't think I'll ever go alone again. It was late October, and the air had turned crisp, the kind that burned your lungs just a little when you breathed in too deep. I had planned a 2-day solo hike through a section of Hoosier National Forest, a place I had visited many times before. I wasn't worried about getting lost. I had my GPS, my paper maps, and my compass. I packed light but smart, enough food for 3 days just in case, and extra layers for the cold nights. The first day was perfect. The sun was out, warming my back as I followed the narrow dirt trail deeper into the forest. The trees were still clinging to the last of their leaves, a mix of reds, oranges, and yellows that made everything feel peaceful. I made good time, stopping only to take a few pictures and eat a quick lunch by a quiet creek. By late afternoon, I reached a clearing that seemed like the perfect place to set up camp. The ground was flat, and there was a thick ring of trees blocking the wind. I pitched my tent, collected some firewood, and settled in for the night. As the sun set, the forest came alive in a different way. The chirping birds were replaced by the sounds of insects and the occasional rustle of something moving through the underbrush. I wasn't worried. I had been out here enough times to know the difference between a deer passing through and something that should make me nervous. The night was uneventful. I slept well, waking only a few times to adjust my sleeping bag. When morning came, I felt refreshed and ready to tackle the second half of my hike. I packed up my gear, made sure my fire was completely out, and got back on the trail. It was around noon when I started noticing something odd. The forest felt different. It wasn't anything obvious, just a feeling. The air was heavier, the silence deeper. I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe the overcast sky was making everything seem darker, more enclosed. I kept moving. A couple of hours later, I came across something that stopped me in my tracks. A tent, abandoned and half collapsed, sat just off the trail. It looked like it had been there for a while. The fabric was weathered, streaked with dirt and mold. The front flap hung open, revealing a sleeping bag inside. Something about it felt wrong. I stepped closer, my breath coming a little faster. There were clothes scattered around, a backpack that had been torn open, its contents spilled onto the ground, a mess of canned food, a rusted knife, a pair of hiking boots, one lying on its side. I called out, "Hello!" My voice sounded too loud, too sharp in the quiet. No answer. I stood there for a minute, debating what to do. The gear looked like it had been sitting there for at least a few months, maybe longer. No sign of an animal attack, no blood, just abandoned. I should have turned around right then, but I didn't. I told myself it was nothing. Someone had left in a hurry. Maybe they had an emergency and couldn't come back for their things. I took a deep breath and walked away. An hour later, I found the second site. It was the same. Another tent, another pile of scattered belongings. This one was worse. The tent was slashed open, its poles broken, clothes torn and dirty. A small camp stove knocked on its side. And then I saw the notebook. It was lying in the dirt just outside the tent, the cover warped from rain and sun. I bent down and picked it up. The pages were damp, the ink smudged in places, but I could still read most of it. The entries were short. They talked about the hike, about the weather. Then, around the middle of the book, the tone changed. Something is following me. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I turned the page. The next entry was frantic, the handwriting messier. It's out there, watching. I hear it at night, closer each time. I swallowed, flipping through the remaining pages. The last entry was almost unreadable. The words scrawled across the paper in shaky lines. It's outside my tent. I can hear it breathing. I'm not alone. That was it. No name, no date. Just that last sentence. I dropped the notebook. My hands were shaking. I looked around, suddenly aware of how quiet the forest had become. I needed to leave. I turned back the way I came, walking fast, almost jogging. Every rustle, every snap of a twig made my heart hammer against my ribs. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone, following me. The sun was sinking lower, the sky turning that pale gray-blue of early evening. I had at least 2 hours before I reached my original campsite, and after that, another 3 to get back to my car. Then I heard it, a branch snapping, too loud to be just the wind. I stopped, heart pounding, and listened. Another snap, closer. I turned, scanning the trees. Nothing, but I could feel it. Something was out there. I started walking again, faster this time, forcing myself not to break into a full run. Running would be a mistake. Running made you look like prey. The noises kept coming. Footsteps, too heavy to be an animal. Always just out of sight, just far enough that I couldn't be sure. By the time I reached my campsite, the sun had almost set. I didn't stop. I didn't even look at where my tent had been. I just kept moving. It was full dark when I finally saw the parking lot. My car sitting there like a lifeline. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I dropped them. I forced myself to breathe, to focus. I grabbed the keys, unlocked the door, and threw myself inside, slamming the lock down. I sat there for a long time, gripping the wheel, my whole body trembling. Eventually, I started the car and drove away. I don't know what happened in that forest. I don't know who or what left those campsites behind. But I do know one thing. I wasn't alone out there. And whatever was watching me, I think it wanted me to know. I had been looking forward to this solo hiking trip for months. The plan was simple. Drive out to a remote section of the national forest, follow an old, rarely used trail up through the ridgeline, and camp for the night before heading back down. It was supposed to be a quiet getaway, just me and the wilderness. No distractions, no responsibilities. I wanted the solitude, the sense of being completely disconnected from everything. But looking back, I should have trusted that nagging feeling in my gut. The trail was unmarked, something I found online from a hiker's forum. It wasn't well maintained, which was part of the appeal. I wanted something rugged, something that felt like an actual adventure. The only thing I had to go off was an old GPS route someone had uploaded years ago, and even that wasn't entirely clear. But I wasn't worried. I'd hiked enough to trust my instincts, and I had all the gear I needed in case anything went wrong. I parked my truck on the side of the dirt road, shouldered my pack, and started into the trees. The first few miles were perfect. Cool air, the smell of pine, the soft crunch of dirt and leaves beneath my boots. The trail itself was narrow, winding through thick forest, but it was easy enough to follow. Occasionally, I had to step over fallen branches or duck under low-hanging limbs, but that was part of the experience. It wasn't until I reached the ridge that things started to feel off. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it had gotten. No birds, no insects, not even the wind rustling through the trees. Just silence. At first, I figured it was just a weird pocket of stillness. Sometimes you get that in the forest. But as I kept moving, the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I caught myself checking over my shoulder more than once, expecting to see something, but there was nothing. just trees and rocks and the empty trail behind me. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe I was just hyper-aware since I was hiking alone. Maybe my brain was overcompensating for the lack of noise. I pushed forward, refusing to let my imagination get the best of me. The trail climbed higher, cutting along the edge of the ridge. It was steep in some areas, the kind of path that forced you to keep your eyes down so you didn't trip over roots or loose rocks. I was focused, placing one foot carefully in front of the other, when I noticed something strange. Footprints. At first, I thought they were mine, but when I looked closer, I realized they were different, bigger, wider, and they were going in the same direction as me, not back the way I came. My stomach tightened. I hadn't seen another car parked near the trailhead, and this wasn't the kind of place people stumbled upon by accident. It was remote. If someone else was out here, they had either come a long way or had been here for a while. I told myself it was fine. Probably another hiker, maybe a hunter scouting the area. But there was something about the tracks that bothered me. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. Maybe a day or two, tops. And they were deep, like whoever made them was carrying something heavy. I kept moving, telling myself I was overthinking things. But that uneasy feeling in my gut didn't go away. I made it to my planned campsite by late afternoon. A small clearing tucked between the trees with a decent overlook of the valley below. It was beautiful, peaceful even. I forced myself to relax as I set up my tent, gathered some wood for a fire, and settled in for the night. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the uneasy feeling crept back in. The silence hadn't lifted. Normally, by this time of evening, you'd hear crickets, owls, the distant rustle of small animals moving through the brush. But there was nothing, just the crackling of my fire and my own breathing. I ate my dinner quickly, my back to the fire, watching the darkness beyond the trees. I told myself again that I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I decided to turn in early, hoping that sleep would come quickly. I zipped myself into my tent, keeping my knife close, just in case. The night dragged on. Every time I started to drift off, some small noise would jolt me awake. A snap of a twig, the sound of shifting dirt. At some point, I must have actually fallen asleep because I woke up to something. A noise. Close. I held my breath, straining to hear. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the wind, finally picking up, rustling through the trees. Then there it was again. A soft, deliberate crunch. Footsteps. My blood went cold. I lay completely still, gripping my knife so tight my fingers ached. The steps were slow, careful. Not the random movement of an animal. Someone was out there. I stayed frozen, my heart hammering in my chest. Then the steps stopped, right outside my tent. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing, just silence. I didn't move, didn't breathe. And then, slowly, the footsteps started again, moving away this time, fading into the trees. I waited. 5 minutes, 10, 20. I didn't move until I was sure whoever or whatever was gone. When I finally worked up the courage, I unzipped my tent just enough to peek outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting just enough light to see the clearing. Nothing, no movement, no sign of anyone. But there, in the dirt just outside my tent, footprints, not mine, not the ones I'd seen earlier. These were fresh. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I kept my knife in my hand, every muscle in my body tense, waiting for the sound of footsteps to return. But they never did. At the first hint of daylight, I packed up my gear as fast as I could. I didn't eat, didn't make coffee. I just wanted to get out. The hike down was brutal. I kept expecting to hear someone behind me, to see movement in the trees. But I never did. Just that same crushing silence. I made it back to my truck just as the sun fully broke over the horizon. I threw my gear in the back, locked the doors, and sat there for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head, that I was just imagining things. But I knew better. I don't know who was out there with me that night. I don't know what they wanted. But I do know one thing. I'll never go back to that trail again. The trailhead was quiet when I arrived, just the way I liked it. Early morning air still held a chill, and the scent of damp earth filled my lungs as I adjusted the straps of my pack. I'd planned this solo hike for weeks, a remote, lesser-known trail deep in the mountains, far from crowded national parks. The plan was simple: a full day of hiking to a remote lake, set up camp for the night, and then hike back the next morning. I had checked the weather, packed my essentials, and let a friend know where I was going. Everything was in place. The first few miles were smooth. The trail climbed gradually through thick pine forests, the path well-worn but empty. I moved steadily, enjoying the quiet, just the crunch of my boots and the occasional call of birds. As the morning passed, I came across old trail markers, some weathered and barely legible. I took comfort in them, knowing I was on the right path. Around midday, the forest began to thin, giving way to rocky terrain. I paused to drink some water and check my map. Everything lined up. I should reach the lake by late afternoon. The sun was warm now, and sweat beaded on my neck. An hour later, I reached a fork in the trail. The map showed only one path. That made me pause. One direction led downhill, the other continued up along the ridge. I pulled out my GPS, but the signal flickered, unreliable this deep in the wilderness. I decided to follow the ridge. Higher ground was always a safer bet. As I walked, something began to feel off. The trees were different, denser, the undergrowth tangled and untouched. The trail itself was narrower, the dirt packed tight like no one had walked it in a long time. I shook the feeling off. Maybe this was an older part of the trail, one less used. But then I saw the first sign that something was wrong. A boot print in the dirt, partially washed away by rain, but not old enough to be ancient. It was deep, larger than mine, and facing the direction I'd come from. Someone else had been here, but they had been going the other way. I kept moving, but now my steps felt heavier. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me. Solo hiking could do that. Every little thing felt bigger, more important than it really was. I was fine. Another hour passed, and the sun dipped lower. I should have reached the lake by now. The thought nagged at me. Had I taken the wrong trail after all? The landscape had changed. More boulders, fewer trees. The terrain was rougher than I had expected. I checked my map again, my compass. The readings made no sense. Then I found the second boot print. This one was fresh. The dirt had been disturbed recently, maybe within the last few hours. And it wasn't alone. There were others, faint but there, all facing the way I had come. Someone had been following the trail behind me. I turned, scanning the trees, listening. Nothing, just wind pushing through the pines. I swallowed, forcing myself to stay calm. Maybe another hiker had come through earlier and I just hadn't seen them. Maybe my nerves were playing tricks on me. I pushed forward, faster now. The sooner I reached the lake, the sooner I could set up camp and shake this feeling. The light was fading by the time I realized the trail was gone. It wasn't a gradual thing. One moment, I was following a narrow but clear path. The next, the ground ahead was untouched, wild, as if no trail had ever existed. I turned in a slow circle. The way I had come still looked like a path, but ahead, nothing. Just wilderness. A deep unease settled in my gut. I was lost. Somehow, somewhere, I had made a mistake. I pulled out my GPS again. No signal. My map was useless now. I needed to backtrack. As I turned, I saw it. A single boot print right where I had just walked. Facing me, the air around me felt heavier, like the world had grown too still. My breath came faster. I scanned the trees, searching for movement, but saw nothing. Someone was out here. Someone was following me. I didn't think. I started moving fast. My boots slammed against the dirt, rocks shifting beneath me. I had to get back to familiar ground. The forest closed in as I ran, branches clawing at my arms. Minutes blurred. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I just ran. Then, ahead, a flicker of movement. I skidded to a stop, heart hammering. A figure stood in the trees, half hidden in the shadows. Too still. Watching. I couldn't see their face. I took a step back. The figure didn't move. Another step. My foot caught on a root and I stumbled. When I looked up again, the figure was gone. I bolted, my legs burned, lungs screaming for air, but I didn't stop. I ran until my body refused to go further. When I finally collapsed, gasping, I was somewhere different. The trees looked unfamiliar, but I could see the sky opening up ahead, clearing. I forced myself forward, and then I saw the lake. Relief flooded me, but it was short-lived. There, near the shoreline, were more boot prints, dozens of them, some old, some fresh, and in the center of them, something worse. A pile of ashes, charred wood, and the remains of something that had been burned. Not logs, not trash, bones. My stomach lurched. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short gasps. My mind raced. Who had been here? What had happened? A sound cut through the silence. A low crunch of footsteps on gravel. Close. I turned, and for the briefest moment, I saw movement between the trees. I ran. I didn't stop. Not when my legs screamed. Not when branches tore at my skin. I ran until my body gave out, and I collapsed in a heap near the edge of the trailhead, where my car sat waiting. Morning light was breaking over the trees. I had been running all night. I scrambled into my car, locked the doors, and sped down the mountain without looking back. I never reported it. What would I say? That I had taken a wrong turn and found something I wasn't supposed to? That someone or something had been out there watching? I don't hike alone anymore, and I never went back. I had planned this trip for weeks. A solo hike through a remote section of the forest, a place where few people ventured. The idea was to get away from everything, no emails, no traffic, no noise. Just me, the trees, and miles of trail. The morning I set out, the sky was clear, the air crisp. My pack was heavy, loaded with supplies, tent, sleeping bag, food, extra clothes, a first aid kit, and a GPS unit. I had checked everything twice, made sure I had all the essentials. I even left my planned route with a friend, just in case. The first few miles were perfect. The trail wound through dense trees, the kind of deep green that only exists in forests untouched by roads and buildings. Birds chirped, and the occasional rustling of leaves let me know I wasn't completely alone. Deer, maybe a fox, nothing threatening. After about 5 miles, I reached a stream and refilled my water bottle, using a filter to make sure it was safe to drink. I took a break, eating a protein bar while sitting on a fallen log. The silence was deep, broken only by the occasional whisper of wind through the branches. It felt peaceful, exactly what I had been looking for. Then I saw it. At first, I wasn't sure what I was looking at. Something about 20 yards off the trail, just barely visible through the trees. A shape, upright, not an animal. I stood, squinting. It looked like a tree stump at first, but as I moved a little closer, I saw it was something else entirely. A tent, old, faded, sagging in the middle. I hesitated. There wasn't supposed to be anyone else out here, at least not according to the park's records. I had checked beforehand, no recent permits for this area. But there it was, unmistakable. I should have turned around. I should have just kept walking. But curiosity got the better of me. I stepped off the trail, moving carefully, scanning the area. The tent was in bad shape, the fabric torn in places, the color washed out from exposure. No sign of a campfire, no footprints in the dirt. It looked like it had been there for a long time. "Hello," I called, my voice unnaturally loud in the quiet woods. No answer. I took another step closer. The entrance of the tent was unzipped, the flap hanging open just enough for me to see inside. A sleeping bag, crumpled. A backpack, partially unzipped, its contents spilling out. Clothes, a flashlight, a notebook with pages curling at the edges from moisture. But no person. Something about it felt wrong. There was an eerie stillness, the kind you feel in abandoned places, where it seems like whoever was there had left in a hurry. Then I noticed the knife. It lay on the ground just outside the tent, half buried in the dirt. A hunting knife, its handle worn, the blade rusted. I swallowed hard. I didn't touch anything. I took a few steps back, my heart pounding. Maybe it was just an old campsite someone had left behind. Maybe it was nothing. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt that heavy weight in my gut. Something wasn't right. I turned and made my way back to the trail, walking faster now. The trees felt closer than before, the air colder. I walked for another mile before stopping to catch my breath. I told myself I was being paranoid. Just an old campsite, nothing more. But then I noticed something else. The silence. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. I listened, holding my breath. A twig snapped behind me. I spun around, scanning the trees. Nothing, just the empty woods. But I knew what I had heard. I picked up my pace. My plan had been to camp overnight, but now I wasn't so sure. Maybe I'd just keep hiking until I got back to my car. Another sound. Closer. Not a twig snapping this time. A rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. I didn't stop to look. I started walking faster, then jogging. My pack bounced on my back, my breath coming in sharp bursts. The trail twisted through the trees, narrowing in places. My boots hit the dirt hard, every step loud in the unnatural quiet. Then I saw something ahead. At first, I thought it was another tent. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a tent at all. It was another abandoned campsite. A torn sleeping bag, a rusted cooking pot, and a jacket draped over a fallen tree. I stopped cold. Then I heard it again. A sound behind me. I ran. My pack slowed me down, but I didn't care. I just ran, feet pounding against the dirt, lungs burning. I didn't stop until I saw the trailhead. The sight of my car, the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I threw my pack in the back, locked the doors, and sat there, hands shaking. I looked back at the trail, half expecting to see something or someone standing there. But there was nothing, just the trees, silent and unmoving. I started the car and left, gravel crunching under the tires as I sped away. I never went back, and I never found out who or what had been watching me in those woods. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A solo hike through a remote section of the wilderness, miles from any roads or crowds, just me and the quiet of the forest. The plan was simple. Hike in, camp for 2 nights, and hike back. I had done plenty of solo hikes before, but this one was different. More isolated, more challenging, and, as I would come to realize, far more dangerous. The first day started off well. The trail was rough but manageable, winding through dense forest with occasional openings where I could catch glimpses of distant ridges. My pack was heavy, but nothing I couldn't handle. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, and aside from the occasional rustle in the underbrush, it was silent. I hiked for nearly 6 hours before deciding to make camp near a small creek. I set up my tent, filtered some water, and cooked a simple meal on my stove. As the sun set, I sat by the fire, staring into the flames and listening to the water trickle over the rocks. There was a deep sense of peace out here. No cars, no voices, no distractions. Just nature. That night, I slept deeply, waking only once to the distant sound of something moving in the brush. Probably a deer, maybe a raccoon. I was too tired to care. The second day, I pushed further into the wilderness. The trail was less defined here, just a faint path through the undergrowth. I had to keep my eyes on my GPS to make sure I stayed on course. I saw no other hikers, no signs of recent human activity, just endless trees and the occasional distant call of a bird. Around midday, I came across an old hunting stand, half-rotted and leaning to one side. It looked abandoned for years, but something about it unsettled me. The steps leading up to the platform were broken, and there were deep claw marks in the wood. Bears, maybe. I moved on, shaking off the unease. By late afternoon, I reached my planned campsite, a small clearing near a ridgeline. It had an eerie feel to it, maybe because the trees around it were twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching in odd directions. I ignored the feeling and set up camp, making sure to hang my food away from the tent. That night, I woke to the sound of something moving outside. It wasn't the normal rustle of small animals. This was slow, deliberate, heavy. I held my breath, listening. Then nothing. Silence except for the wind through the trees. I stayed awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling of my tent, listening. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted back to sleep. The third day, everything changed. I packed up early, eager to start the hike back. As I walked, I had the constant, nagging feeling that something was off. The trail seemed different, though I knew it was the same. The trees felt closer. The air felt heavier. About 2 hours into my hike, I saw something ahead on the trail. At first, I thought it was a fallen log, but as I got closer, my stomach tightened. It was a backpack, old, dirty, torn. A few feet away, a boot, just one. I stopped, my heart pounding. No sign of anyone. No trail leading away from the spot. Just the abandoned gear, sitting there like it had been dropped suddenly. I told myself it was probably an old campsite that had been abandoned. Maybe someone got lost and left their stuff. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The backpack looked wrong. It looked like it had been there too long, but not long enough to be completely ruined by the elements. I kept moving, faster now, my senses on high alert. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the leaves sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. Then I saw it, a structure barely visible through the trees. It wasn't on my map. It shouldn't have been there. It was small, like a shed or an old cabin. The door was slightly open. I didn't want to look, but some part of me had to. I stepped closer, heart hammering, and peered inside. The smell hit me first. Rot, dampness, something else I couldn't place. The interior was dark, but I could see enough. A sleeping bag torn open, old cans of food stacked in one corner, a knife, rusted, lying on the floor, and scratches on the walls, deep, desperate scratches. I backed away fast, my breath coming in short gasps. Someone had been here, maybe still was. I turned and walked quickly, then broke into a run. I didn't stop, didn't look back. The forest felt wrong now, like it was closing in. By the time I reached a recognizable part of the trail, I was drenched in sweat. I hiked non-stop for the rest of the day, ignoring the burning in my legs, the ache in my shoulders. I just needed to get out. When I finally reached my car, I locked the doors the second I got inside. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I never reported what I saw. Maybe I should have, but part of me doesn't want to know the truth. I never went back to that trail, never even looked at a map of that area again. Some places aren't meant to be explored. I checked my pack one last time. Water, food, flashlight, first aid, my knife. Everything was in place. The sun was still high, but I knew it would sink fast. I wasn't worried. I had planned this hike for weeks. Mapped out every step, checked the weather, even read up on the terrain. It was a solo hike, something I like to do every now and then. Just me and the trail, no distractions. No phone calls, no emails. Just silence. The first few miles were easy. The trees cast long shadows across the dirt path, and birds called from deep in the forest. The air smelled like pine, rich and sharp. My boots crunched against gravel and fallen leaves. I moved at a steady pace, taking my time. No need to rush. The whole point was to take it in, to get away from everything for a little while. After an hour, the trail became steeper. I felt the strain in my legs, the burn in my calves. Sweat trickled down my back. I welcomed it. This was what I came for, the challenge, the effort, the reminder that my body was still strong. About 3 miles in, I stopped to drink some water. I leaned against a fallen log, listening to the forest. It was quiet, too quiet. The usual rustling of small animals in the underbrush was gone. No birdsong, no wind, just stillness. I told myself not to think too much about it. The forest was full of patterns, rhythms. Maybe the animals had settled down for the evening. Maybe I had just imagined the change. I continued on, but the feeling stuck with me. It was a prickling at the back of my neck, a vague unease that made me glance over my shoulder more than once. The trail narrowed, winding between tall trees. Their trunks were thick and gnarled, their bark rough under my fingertips when I reached out to steady myself. The deeper I went, the darker it became. The canopy above was dense, blocking out the last of the sunlight. I checked my watch. I had plenty of time before sunset, but I needed to pick up the pace if I wanted to reach my planned campsite before dark. The trail dipped suddenly, leading into a valley. The air here was cooler, damp. The ground was softer, covered in a thick layer of fallen leaves. Each step felt muffled. I adjusted my pack, rolling my shoulders to ease the tension building there. A sound made me stop. A single snap, a branch breaking somewhere behind me. I turned, scanning the trees. Nothing. I waited, listening. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Then, another snap. Closer. I wasn't alone. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe a raccoon, but something about it felt wrong. The footsteps weren't fast or skittish. They were slow, deliberate. I gripped the strap of my pack and started walking again. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. I moved quickly, but not too quickly. Running would be stupid. Running would make noise, and I didn't want to make noise. The footsteps followed. Not right behind me, but close enough. Close enough that I knew it wasn't my imagination. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my knife. I flicked it open, holding it at my side, just in case. The trail curved ahead, leading up a small incline. If I could make it to higher ground, I might be able to see who or what was behind me. Quicken my pace. Halfway up the hill, my foot caught on a root. I stumbled, cursing under my breath. My knee hit the dirt hard. Pain flared up my leg, and then I heard it. A breath. Close. Too close. I twisted around, knife in hand. Nothing. Just trees. Just darkness. My breath came fast and shallow. I pushed myself up, ignoring the throbbing in my knee. I needed to move. Now, I forced myself to climb the rest of the way. My legs burned. My lungs ached, but I didn't stop until I reached the top. I turned, scanning the trail behind me. Still nothing, but I knew in my gut, that I wasn't alone. I had to keep going. The campsite was another mile ahead. I could make it. I had to. I moved fast, almost jogging. The light was fading. Shadows stretched long across the trail. The footsteps followed, always just behind, never too close, never far enough away. I clenched my jaw, gripping my knife tighter. My fingers were slick with sweat. And then, a shape, ahead, on the trail. I skidded to a stop. My breath caught in my throat. A man. He stood in the middle of the path, facing me, tall, still. His clothes were dark, blending with the shadows. I didn't move. He didn't move. A long moment stretched between us. The forest around us was silent. Then he took a step forward. I backed away. My pulse roared in my ears. Another step. Slow. Measured. I turned and ran. Branches whipped against my face. My pack bounced against my back. I didn't care. I just ran. The footsteps pounded behind me. Faster now. The trail blurred. My breath came in ragged gasps. The campsite, I had to reach the campsite. I burst through the trees and stumbled into the clearing. My tent was there, right where I left it. I spun around. Nothing. No footsteps. No man. Just the dark forest staring back at me. I stood there, panting, knife still clenched in my hand. Minutes passed. My breathing slowed. My muscles shook. I forced myself to move, to check my tent, to make sure I was really alone. But I didn't sleep that night. I sat with my back against a tree, knife in my lap, watching the woods, waiting, listening. The footsteps never came again. By dawn, I was gone. I never liked hiking alone. I always told myself it was because I enjoyed sharing the experience with someone, but deep down, I knew the real reason. I wasn't built for the isolation, the silence, the way the woods swallowed sound. But that day, I didn't have much of a choice. I had planned the trip with my buddy, Mike. We were going to hike a remote trail in the mountains of northern Montana. He bailed last minute because of work, but I had already taken time off, and I wasn't going to waste it. I convinced myself that a solo trip would be good for me. I packed my gear, triple-checked my supplies, and hit the road before sunrise. The drive took longer than expected. The last stretch was on a winding dirt road, barely wide enough for my truck. Trees pressed in on both sides, their branches clawing at the windows. The trailhead was unmarked, just a small clearing where I parked. I checked my phone, no signal. That was expected. I took one last look at the truck, shouldered my pack, and started walking. The first few miles were peaceful. The air was cool, the scent of pine thick and sharp. The trail was narrow but well-trodden, winding through dense forest before opening up to occasional clearings. I kept a steady pace, listening to the rhythmic crunch of my boots on the dirt. Birds called from the canopy, and somewhere in the distance, I heard the faint trickle of water. Around midday, I stopped at a small stream to refill my water bottle. The water was icy cold, and I splashed some on my face. That's when I noticed the first sign that something was off. There were no animal tracks near the stream. Usually, you'd see something: deer prints, raccoon tracks, maybe even bear sign. But the mud along the water's edge was smooth and untouched, like no animal had been here in days. I tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. Animals move in cycles, I told myself. Maybe they just hadn't come through recently. I pushed on. The trail climbed steadily, leading me higher into the mountains. The trees thinned out, and the views became more open, revealing jagged peaks in the distance. I stopped to take a few pictures, the beauty momentarily distracting me from the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. By late afternoon, I reached a plateau where I planned to camp for the night. The site was perfect: flat ground, a natural windbreak of boulders, and a small fire ring left by previous hikers. I set up my tent, gathered some wood, and got a small fire going. The warmth felt good as the temperature started to drop. I ate a simple meal, watching the sky fade from orange to deep blue. Then the silence set in. I hadn't noticed it until then, but the forest had gone completely still. No birds, no insects, nothing. It was the kind of silence that presses in, makes your skin prickle. I told myself it was normal, that the cold had just quieted the usual sounds of the forest. Still, I kept my head on a swivel, scanning the darkening trees. I forced myself to relax. I'd hiked before. I knew how my mind could play tricks on me when I was alone. I put out the fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped myself inside my sleeping bag. The warmth was comforting, and despite the uneasy feeling, exhaustion took over. I don't know what woke me up. It was still dark, the kind of blackness where you can't tell if your eyes are open or closed. I lay there listening. My breath sounded too loud in the quiet. I strained my ears, trying to pick up any sound outside the tent. Then I heard it, a single footstep. Not the rustle of a small animal, not the shifting of branches. A deliberate step on the dirt. My body went rigid. I held my breath, heart hammering in my chest. Then, another step. Closer. I reached slowly for the knife in my pack, careful not to make a sound. The fabric of the tent felt thin, fragile, like the only thing separating me from whatever was outside. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I could hear breathing low, steady. Then, something pressed against the fabric. A hand. I lunged, shoving my knife forward. The blade punched through the tent, meeting resistance. A sharp intake of breath. Whoever it was hadn't expected me to fight back. There was a scuffling sound, and then the footsteps retreated, fast and stumbling. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent, and burst out, scanning the darkness. Nothing. The trees loomed, shadows stretching long under the pale moonlight. I listened, but the only sound was my own ragged breathing. I wasn't alone out here. Someone had been watching me. I didn't bother packing up. I grabbed my essentials, leaving the tent and anything I couldn't carry. I flicked on my headlamp and started moving. Fast. The trail was harder to follow in the dark, but I didn't care. I needed to put as much distance between me and that campsite as possible. I walked for hours, adrenaline keeping me going. My legs ached, my throat was dry, but I didn't stop. Eventually, The sky lightened, the first hints of dawn breaking through the trees. That's when I saw it, my truck. But something was wrong. The driver's side door was open. My stomach dropped. I had locked it, I was sure of it. I stepped closer, heart pounding. The inside was trashed. Glove compartment open, paper scattered, my backpack slashed open. But nothing was stolen. My keys were still on the seat. My wallet, untouched. It wasn't a robbery. It was a message. I didn't waste time. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. Gravel sprayed as I tore out of there, not stopping until I hit pavement. I drove straight home, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. I never reported it. What would I even say? That someone had followed me into the woods, watched me, waited outside my tent? That they had broken into my truck but taken nothing? I still don't know who it was or what they wanted. But I do know one thing: I'll never hike alone again. I parked my truck at the trailhead just after sunrise. The gravel lot was empty except for an old, beat-up sedan that looked like it had been there a while. The morning air was crisp, the kind that wakes you up fast. I double-checked my pack, water, snacks, flashlight, extra layers, and set off. The trail started easy, a dirt path winding through pines. Birds chirped, leaves rustled, and my boots crunched against the ground. It felt good to be out, away from the noise of work, traffic, and people. The forecast had called for clear skies, but the air carried the heavy scent of damp earth like it had rained recently. I planned to hike about 10 miles out and back. The map showed a small clearing by a creek where I'd stop for lunch before turning around. I wasn't worried about getting lost, the trail was well marked, and I had a GPS app just in case. The first few miles passed without issue. The woods were quiet, the kind of quiet that presses in. I noticed the usual sounds: squirrels darting through leaves, the occasional crack of a branch. But there was something else, a stillness, the kind that makes your stomach tighten for no reason. I shook it off, just my mind playing tricks. A few miles in, I came across an old wooden sign. The paint had long since faded, but the arrows still pointed left and right. The left path led deeper into the woods, toward my planned lunch spot. The right one, according to my map, was an old logging road that hadn't been maintained in years. I stuck to my plan and went left. As I walked, I noticed fresh footprints in the dirt. They weren't mine. Deep boot prints, heavier than my own. Someone else had been here recently. Nothing strange about that. Hiking trails got plenty of visitors. Still, I hadn't seen another soul since I parked. I checked over my shoulder, but the woods were empty. Around mile 5, I reached the creek. It was wider than I expected, cutting through the forest with clear, rushing water. The clearing was perfect, flat ground, a few logs for sitting, and plenty of shade. I dropped my pack and sat down, letting my legs rest while I ate. The water looked clean, but I had a filter if I needed more to drink later. As I chewed my food, I caught movement on the opposite bank, a figure half hidden by the trees. My stomach clenched before my brain could process what I was looking at. A man. He was standing still, facing me from about 40 feet away. I swallowed hard. I'd been in the woods enough to know most people would at least wave or call out when they saw another hiker. But he just stood there. His clothes were dark, maybe damp. I couldn't make out his face through the trees. I glanced at my pack, considering my options. Nothing about him seemed outright dangerous, but something felt off. My gut told me to move. I packed up my trash and stood, pretending not to notice him. When I looked back up, he was gone. I scanned the trees. Nothing, just the sound of water and wind in the branches. I forced myself to breathe, slung my pack over my shoulders, and started walking. The uneasy feeling clung to me. I kept checking behind me, half expecting to see the man following. The trail narrowed as it climbed uphill, the trees pressing in on either side. I picked up my pace. Then I saw the footprints again, fresh, deep, and this time they were over mine. I stopped cold. My brain scrambled to make sense of it. I'd just come this way not long ago. No way someone had passed me without me noticing. My breath came quicker now. I looked up the trail, scanning the trees, the ridgeline, anywhere someone might be watching from. Nothing. I kept moving faster now. The quiet had returned, heavier than before. My ears strained for any sound. Footsteps, branches breaking, anything. The sun had shifted, throwing long shadows across the ground. Then, up ahead, something caught my eye. A shape, dark against the path. My stomach dropped. A backpack. A big, dark-colored pack sitting just off the trail, half unzipped. I slowed, my heart hammering. No sign of its owner. No tent, no fire, nothing. Just the pack, abandoned like someone had dropped it and walked away. I stepped closer, scanning the area. It didn't look like it had been sitting there long. The fabric was clean, no leaves piled on top. I hesitated, then crouched down to get a better look. The zipper was halfway open, revealing clothing, a water bottle, and a rolled-up sleeping bag. No ID, no phone. Something about it felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be seeing it. A crack echoed through the trees. I spun around, my pulse spiking. The sound had come from up the trail, maybe 50 yards ahead. My mouth went dry. I could feel eyes on me. I didn't wait. I turned and started back the way I came, forcing myself not to run. Running made you pray. Just keep moving. Breathe. The trail felt longer now, like the woods were shifting around me. Every snap of a twig made my muscles lock up. I kept glancing back, expecting to see that man step onto the path. But he never did. I pushed forward, ignoring the burn in my legs. The light had changed again. Dimmer now, though the sun shouldn't have been setting yet. My truck wasn't far. I just had to get there. When I finally broke out of the trees, the parking lot was still empty. My truck sat where I left it, dust coating the windshield. I reached it, yanked open the door, and locked it behind me. My hands trembled as I started the engine. I forced myself to take slow breaths, to think. That pack, those footprints, that man. I pulled out of the lot, my eyes flicking to the trailhead in the mirror. Nothing moved. I never reported it. What would I even say? That I saw someone standing in the woods? That I found a backpack and got scared? Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks. But I haven't been back to that trail since. The morning air was crisp as I tightened my backpack straps and started down the narrow dirt trail. The plan was simple. A solo overnight hike into the mountains. Something I'd done before, just never this deep. The national forest stretched for miles in every direction. A vast wilderness of towering pines, rocky outcrops, and winding creeks. I had checked the forecast, clear skies, mild temperatures, perfect conditions. The first few miles passed easily. The trail climbed gradually, the sun filtering through the trees, birds chirping somewhere in the distance. My boots crunched against gravel, and the rhythm of my steps became a comfort. The scent of damp earth and pine needles filled the air, mixing with the occasional breeze that carried the distant sound of rushing water. It felt good to be away from everything. No phones, no emails, no noise. Just me and the woods. I made good time, reaching the planned campsite in the late afternoon. It was a flat clearing near a small stream, the perfect spot to set up for the night. I took off my pack, stretched, and started setting up my tent. Everything felt normal, just another night under the stars. As the sun dipped lower, I made a fire, ate a quick meal, and sat on a fallen log, watching the flames dance. The woods were quiet now, the distant rustling of leaves the only sound. It was peaceful. Then, sometime after nightfall, I heard it. It started faint, a steady, rhythmic thudding, almost like footsteps. I froze, listening, trying to figure out what it was. Probably an animal, I told myself. Maybe a deer, maybe just my imagination. But as the minutes passed, the sound didn't fade. It grew closer, heavier. Not the random movement of a wandering animal, but something deliberate. I turned off my headlamp, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. My fire had burned down to embers, and beyond that, The trees were just shapes against the night sky. I listened, holding my breath. The sound had stopped. Silence stretched out, thick and heavy. I told myself it was nothing, just the woods playing tricks on me. I climbed into my tent, zipped it shut, and forced myself to relax. Eventually, I drifted off. I woke up to something moving outside. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal rustling through leaves. It was slow, deliberate movement. My heart pounded as I reached for my knife. I strained to listen, trying to place the sound. Footsteps, heavy, slow. Then silence. I stayed still, every nerve in my body on edge. Nothing happened. Minutes passed, maybe longer. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I unzipped my tent cautiously, peering outside. Nothing. The fire pit was untouched. My backpack still leaned against a tree where I had left it. But then I saw them, footprints in the dirt. Large, deep, leading from the tree line to just a few feet from my tent. They weren't boot prints, bare feet. Whoever it was had stood there, just outside my tent, listening. I packed up fast. I was done. I'd hike out, no breaks, no stops. The feeling of unease sat heavy in my chest as I moved fast, almost jogging down the trail. I kept checking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching from the trees. But the woods were empty, just me and the sound of my own breathing. A few hours passed. The trail felt longer on the way back. My legs burned, my feet ached, but I pushed on, wanting nothing more than to reach my car. Then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The footprints were back, but they weren't mine. The same bare feet following my trail. Fresh. They hadn't been there when I passed earlier. I didn't stop to think. I ran. My pack bounced against my shoulders. My breath came in gasps, but I ran. The trail blurred past me, tree trunks flashing by as I pushed my legs faster. I could hear nothing but my own heartbeat, my own ragged breathing. I didn't look back. I just ran. I reached my car, hands shaking as I fumbled for my keys. I yanked the door open, threw my pack in, and locked the doors the second I was inside. My chest heaved. The lot was empty, just like when I had arrived. No signs of anyone. No movement in the trees. Nothing. I started the engine and peeled out of there, not looking back. The whole drive home, I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see something, someone, following. But there was nothing. Just miles of empty road and the creeping feeling that I had been watched the entire time. I still don't know who it was or what they wanted. I don't want to know, but I haven't hiked alone since. The first thing I noticed was the stillness. Not the kind of quiet you get in the woods where there's always something. Wind shifting through trees, birds calling, the occasional rustle of a squirrel in the underbrush. No, this was different. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. I had started my hike early, before sunrise, wanting to beat the heat. The trail was one I'd done before, nothing extreme, about 10 miles total, a loop through some deep forested hills and back to the trailhead. I had my pack loaded with the usual. Extra water, some protein bars, a first aid kit, and my knife. I wasn't worried about much. Just a nice, long day in the woods to clear my mind. The first few miles were uneventful. The air was crisp, the damp earth smelled fresh, and the birds had started waking up as the sun climbed. I settled into an easy rhythm, my boots crunching softly on the dirt path. It was peaceful, just me and the forest. But somewhere around mile 4, I noticed the change. The birds had gone silent. That wasn't too strange in itself. I've been in areas where predators were around, and everything just sort of shuts up. But there was something about this silence that felt wrong. It wasn't just quiet. It was oppressive. I kept walking, trying to ignore the way my gut tightened. It was probably nothing. Maybe I just imagined how quiet it was. Maybe I was just tired. The mind plays tricks on you in the woods when you're alone. Then I saw the footprints. They weren't mine. I stopped and crouched down, examining them. They were fresh, maybe an hour or two old at most. But something was off. The prints were deep, like whoever left them was carrying something heavy. And they weren't hiking boots. They looked more like work boots, big ones too. That wasn't the strange part, though. The weirdest thing was the way they moved. Instead of following the natural curve of the trail, they went off into the trees. No hesitation, no meandering, just a straight line into the thick underbrush. I straightened up, my heart beating a little faster. People go off-trail all the time, but usually there are signs of struggle, branches pushed aside, snapped twigs. But these tracks were clean, like whoever made them knew exactly where they were going. I shook off the unease and kept moving. The trail would loop back toward the main road soon, and I wasn't in the mood to let some weird footprints ruin my day. But after another mile, I noticed something else. More footprints, and these were fresh, very fresh. The prints were just ahead of me, and this time they were on the trail. I knelt again, touching one of them. The dirt was still settling. Someone had walked this path minutes ago. My skin prickled. I hadn't seen anyone all day, and yet here were these fresh tracks. I listened, straining for any sign of movement. Nothing, just that thick, suffocating silence. I told myself to keep going. People hike these trails all the time. Maybe I just missed them somehow. Maybe they'd stepped off for a break, and I hadn't noticed. But then I saw something else. A piece of fabric caught on a low-hanging branch. I stepped closer and picked it up. Dark, stiff, blood. I dropped it and took a step back. My pulse was hammering now. That was enough for me. I wasn't sticking around to figure out what was going on. I turned around and started back the way I came, moving fast but controlled. I didn't want to run. Running made you sloppy. Running made noise. Running made you look like prey. I kept my eyes on the trail, scanning for movement. My knife was in my hand now, gripped tight. I didn't remember pulling it out. A few minutes passed. Then I heard it. A twig snapping. Not behind me, not ahead. Off to the side. In the trees. I stopped, breath coming fast. My ears strained. Nothing. I moved again. Another snap. Closer. I turned my head slowly, scanning the tree line. My vision tunneled, my body buzzing with adrenaline. There, a shape, person, standing just behind a tree half hidden in the shadows. Watching me, my breath caught in my throat. They didn't move. I couldn't see a face, just the outline. Big, tall, just standing there. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move. I didn't look directly at them. I didn't want them to know I saw them. I just kept walking faster now. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I held back. Running would make it worse. The trail curved ahead. I knew if I could get around that bend, I'd be out of sight for a moment. A chance to move faster. I turned the corner and broke into a sprint. Branches whipped at my arms. My pack bounced hard against my back. I didn't care. I just ran. I didn't stop until I saw my car through the trees. I practically dove for the driver's side, yanking the door open and throwing myself inside. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. I didn't look back. I peeled out of there so fast my tires kicked up dirt. Only when I was miles down the road did I finally let myself breathe. My whole body ached. My hands were locked around the steering wheel in a death grip. I didn't go back to that trail. I still don't know who or what was out there, but I know one thing for sure. I wasn't alone, and whoever was watching me wasn't hiking. I started the hike early, just as the sun was rising, casting a pale light over the dense forest ahead of me. The air was cool, crisp with the scent of damp earth and pine. I had picked this trail because it was remote, far from crowded tourist spots, deep in the wilderness where I wouldn't run into anyone. That was what I wanted, just me and the trail. I had my gear, a sturdy pack with enough food and water for 2 days, a good knife, a compass, and my GPS just in case. Everything I needed. The first few miles were easy, the dirt path wide and well-maintained. Birds chirped in the trees, small animals rustled in the underbrush. The deeper I went, the narrower the trail became, winding through thick forest. The trees grew taller here, their branches forming a canopy that dimmed the light even though it was still morning. The smell of damp moss and decomposing leaves filled my lungs. About 5 miles in, I noticed the first sign that something felt off. The forest was quiet, too quiet. The birds had stopped singing, and even the rustling of small creatures in the undergrowth was gone. It was just my footsteps and my breathing. I stopped for a moment, listening, but there was nothing, just a heavy, unnatural silence. I shook it off and kept moving. Maybe I had just startled the wildlife, or maybe the wind had shifted in a way that carried sounds away from me. The trail became rougher. Tree roots jutted out, making me watch every step. The incline grew steeper. The deeper I went, the less maintained it seemed. At one point, I had to climb over a fallen tree blocking the path. It was old, covered in moss, the wood soft under my hands. My GPS told me I was still on track, though the trail itself was barely visible in places. I hadn't seen any markers for a while. That should have worried me, but I had done hikes like this before. I knew how to navigate. A few hours in, I stopped to rest, leaning against a large rock. I ate a protein bar, drank some water. The silence was still there, thick and heavy. I listened harder. Nothing. No wind, no rustling. Just silence. My own breathing sounded too loud. I pushed the feeling aside and moved on. The landscape was shifting now. The trees were more spaced out, the ground uneven, scattered with loose rocks. I had to go slower. My pack felt heavier. The air had changed, too. It was colder, though the sun was still high. The smell of damp earth was stronger, mixed with something else. Something faint, but unpleasant, like old meat left out too long. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. Then I saw it. A little way off the trail, half hidden behind thick bushes, was a tent. It was old, sun-bleached, torn in places. At first, I thought it had been abandoned, maybe left behind by some careless campers. But the closer I got, the more I saw. The tent had been slashed open, the fabric hanging in jagged strips. The ground around it was disturbed, littered with what looked like personal belongings. Clothes, a boot, an old flashlight. There was no sign of a fire, no camp setup. Just this destroyed tent in the middle of nowhere. I hesitated, my pulse picking up. I wasn't the type to get spooked easily, but something about this felt wrong. If an animal had done this, there should be tracks. There should be some sign of struggle. But the ground was just messy. I took a step closer and that smell hit me again. Stronger this time. Rot, decay. My stomach turned. I pulled my knife from my pack, holding it tight. I didn't like this. Not one bit. My gut was screaming at me to leave, but I had to know. I stepped closer, scanning the area. That's when I saw the backpack near the edge of the clearing. It was torn open, the contents scattered. And just beyond it, something else. Something small. Piece of fabric, soaked dark. My mouth went dry. It was a shirt. A child's shirt. I backed away, heart pounding. This wasn't just an abandoned campsite. Something had happened here. Something bad. I turned, forcing myself to move quickly, retracing my steps to the trail. My mind raced. Who had camped there? How long ago? Where were they now? I didn't want to find out. My only goal was to get back to the main road, back to my car. I walked fast, almost running, but the trail didn't look the same. The trees seemed closer together, the path less distinct. My GPS still showed I was on the right route, but my gut said otherwise. I felt watched. Every step, I expected to hear something behind me. A branch snapping, footsteps in the leaves. But there was nothing, just silence. That awful, suffocating silence. Then, ahead of me, something moved, a shadow between the trees. My breath caught. It was fast, slipping between trunks, too quick to see clearly. I gripped my knife, my other hand shaking as I checked my GPS again. Still on track, still heading the right way, but my gut told me to move faster. I picked up my pace. The trees blurred around me as I half jogged, my breath coming hard. Then I saw something ahead that made my stomach drop. Another campsite, destroyed just like the first. This one was worse. The tent was collapsed, shredded. More scattered belongings. and the smell strong, choking. The same smell from before, but heavier. I saw something dark on the ground. Blood. A lot of it. My vision tunneled. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't some animal attack. Something was out here. I ran. I didn't care about the GPS, about the trail. I just ran, crashing through underbrush, branches whipping at my arms. My pack bounced against my back, making it harder to move, but I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. I ran until my legs burned, until my lungs felt like they would burst. And then, finally, the road. I stumbled onto it, falling to my knees on the rough asphalt. My car was there, just a few feet away. I scrambled to my feet, throwing my pack off as I fumbled for my keys. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped them. I got the door open, threw myself inside, and locked it. I sat there, gasping for air, staring at the trees, waiting, watching. Nothing moved. I turned the car on and sped away, not stopping until I was miles down the road. Not until I was back in town, back in civilization. I never reported what I saw. I don't know why. Maybe because I didn't have answers. Maybe because I didn't want to go back. Maybe because I was afraid of what I'd find if someone did investigate. But I know this. I'll never go back there. And if you ever find yourself on a lonely trail, deep in the woods, and the silence sets in, run. I don't know why I thought hiking alone was a good idea. It wasn't my first time on the trails, and I had done solo hikes before, but something about this trip felt different. The air was thick with the kind of silence that wasn't normal, not peaceful, just empty. I was miles deep into the woods, far from anyone, and the only sounds were my own footsteps crunching against the damp earth and the occasional rustling of trees swaying in the wind. The trail wasn't one of the popular ones. It had been recommended to me by an older man I met at the ranger station. He told me it was more off the beaten path, and that it led to a hidden lake few people knew about. That's exactly what I was looking for. Something quiet, away from the crowds. Started off fine. The sky was clear, the air was cool, and I had plenty of supplies in my pack. My boots were sturdy, my map was accurate, and my GPS was fully charged. I had double-checked everything before I left. I even left my itinerary with a friend back home, just in case. I thought I was prepared. A few hours in, I noticed the trees were getting denser. The further I went, the narrower the path became. It wasn't anything too concerning, just a sign that this trail really wasn't well-traveled. I liked that, but the deeper I went, the more I realized that there was something unsettling about the forest. The trees here weren't like the ones near the trailhead. They were taller, older, and their branches twisted in ways that looked unnatural, like they had been reaching for something they could never grasp. The bark was peeling in long, ragged strips, and some of the trees had deep gashes in them, as if someone had tried to carve something out of them with a dull blade. Then I found the first sign that something was wrong. A torn backpack lying just off the path. It was covered in dirt and leaves, like it had been there for a long time. It was half buried, but I could see that it had been ripped open. Not just unzipped, ripped, like something had clawed it apart. I crouched down, brushing away the dirt with the sleeve of my jacket. The fabric was shredded, and the straps had been snapped clean through. I looked around, scanning the trees, but I didn't see anything. No tracks, no blood, nothing. Just that pack sitting there like a warning. I told myself it was probably just an old piece of trash. Maybe some animal had gotten to it. Maybe someone had lost it years ago. But as I stood up, I noticed something else. A deep, narrow hole in the ground a few feet away. It was about the size of a manhole, and it looked deliberate, like someone had dug it with purpose. The dirt around the edges was fresh, loose. Something about it made my stomach clench. I should have turned back right then, but I didn't. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was overthinking things. I kept walking. The path became even more difficult. Thick underbrush clawed at my legs, and the trees blocked out more of the light. I checked my GPS. It still showed I was on track. The lake wasn't too far now, but then the second sign came. A a second backpack even more torn up than the first. And this one had something inside, a jacket shredded to the point of being unwearable, a boot with deep gashes in the leather, a crushed water bottle, and a notebook, its pages curled and yellowed from the elements. I picked it up carefully, flipping through the pages. Most of the writing had been ruined by time and weather, but I could make out some words. Watching, not alone, don't look back. I felt my pulse hammering in my throat. I scanned the trees again. Nothing. No movement, no sound. Just that awful silence. I pressed forward, faster now. I just wanted to get to the lake, see it for myself, and then turn around. Maybe it was my way of proving to myself that nothing was wrong, that my mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe it was just stupid pride. Then I heard it. A sound so faint that I wasn't sure I heard it at all. A whisper, just beyond the trees. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was deliberate, like someone was speaking under their breath. Too quiet to make out the words. I stopped in my tracks, holding my breath. The forest was completely still. I didn't hear it again, but I felt it. The sensation of being watched, of something standing just behind me, waiting. I turned sharply, scanning the trees. Nothing. I moved faster, practically jogging now. The underbrush made it difficult, but I didn't care. I just needed to get to the lake, needed to see it. I pushed forward, branches slapping against my arms, my legs aching. Then I saw it. Not the lake, a figure, not a person, at least not anymore. It was slumped against a tree, half hidden by the undergrowth. A body. The skin was stretched tight over bones, the clothes tattered and torn. It had been here a long time, long enough that the smell had faded, long enough that the insects had done their work. My stomach lurched. I staggered back, my breath catching in my throat. My brain screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Then I saw the marks on the tree behind it, deep scratches carved into the bark, the same kind of marks I had seen on the other trees. But this time they weren't random. They formed words, words I could barely read through the rough, jagged lines. ITCs. I didn't stop to think. I ran. I didn't care where I was going. I just ran. My boots hit the ground hard, my breath tearing through my lungs. I kept checking over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. Just trees. Just that awful silence. It felt like hours before I reached the trailhead. My car was still there, waiting for me. I practically threw myself inside, locking the doors, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back in town, surrounded by the noise of traffic and people and normal life. I thought about reporting it. I even drove to the ranger station. But what would I say? That I found a dead body? That I saw some strange writing? That I felt like I was being watched? They'd ask me where, and I wouldn't have an answer. Because when I checked my GPS later, I realized something terrifying. The coordinates were gone. The map showed nothing. No trail, no lake, nothing. Like it was never there to begin with. I checked the trail map one last time, then folded it and stuffed it into my jacket pocket. The sun was still low in the sky, early morning light casting long shadows through the trees. The air was crisp, carrying that earthy, damp smell of the forest. It had rained the night before, and the ground was soft beneath my boots. Perfect hiking conditions. I had planned this solo hike for weeks, a 20-mile loop through the wilderness, following an old logging road that cut deep into the forest before connecting to a more rugged backcountry trail. I wanted solitude, a break from the constant noise of work and the city. The first few miles were easy. The logging road was wide and clear, flanked by towering pines and dense underbrush. Birds chirped somewhere overhead. I focused on the steady rhythm of my footsteps, the feeling of my pack snug against my back. At mile 5, the road narrowed. Thick vegetation pressed in on both sides. The sun had risen higher, filtering through the trees in shifting patches of light. I paused for a drink of water, then pushed on. My map showed that in another 2 miles, I'd reach the backcountry trailhead. That's when things would get more challenging. The first sign that something was wrong was the absence of sound. One moment, the forest was alive with the rustling of leaves, the occasional bird call. The next, complete silence. No wind, no birds, nothing. It was like stepping into a vacuum. I slowed my pace, glancing around. The trees looked the same, the path unchanged. But something about the stillness made my skin crawl. I shook it off. I had read about this. Sometimes in thick forests, sound gets swallowed up. I kept moving. The second sign came about a mile later. The trail was supposed to be well marked. I had studied the map obsessively, and there should have been a clear transition from the old road to the backcountry trail. But as I walked, I never saw it. No signs, no markers, no shift in terrain. Just more trees, more dirt path stretching endlessly ahead. I stopped and pulled out my phone. No signal. That was expected this deep in the woods. But I still didn't like it. I checked my map again. I should have hit the trailhead by now. Maybe I missed it. Maybe the sign had fallen, or I had walked past it without noticing. I turned around, deciding to backtrack. I walked for 10 minutes, then 20. The path still stretched ahead, unchanged. I stopped and turned in a slow circle, heart pounding. The trees looked identical in every direction. Had I gotten turned around? I forced myself to take a deep breath. Think logically. I had followed a straight path. If I kept walking, I would eventually reach something familiar. I kept going. Another 20 minutes passed. My footsteps quickened. My breath came harder. The trail wasn't ending. It wasn't curving or changing. It just kept going, stretching ahead in a way that didn't make sense. Panic crept in at the edges of my mind. I shoved it down. I wasn't lost. I had a map. I had supplies. I just needed to stop, think, and reorient myself. I decided to take a break. I sat on a fallen log, drank some water, and tried to gather my thoughts. The silence pressed in. Then I heard it. Footsteps, distant but steady, coming from up the trail. Relief flooded me. Another hiker, maybe someone who knew the area better. I stood up, ready to wave them down. The footsteps kept coming. Slow, deliberate. Then they stopped. I waited, listening. Nothing. "Hello," I called, my voice strange in the heavy silence. No answer. A cold feeling crept down my spine. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe I had imagined it. I strained my ears, holding my breath. Nothing. I shook my head. I was letting my mind get the best of me. I should keep moving, find my way back. I walked faster now, almost at a jog. The feeling of unease was growing. I needed to get out of here. Then I saw it. A backpack, lying just off the path, half hidden in the underbrush. It looked old, weathered, dirt-covered. I hesitated, then stepped closer. My pulse pounded in my ears. The straps were torn, the fabric slashed open, like something had clawed at it. I knelt down, heart hammering. Inside, there was a crumpled jacket, a few rusted camping utensils. No ID, no phone. But there was something else. A notebook. I picked it up with shaky hands. The pages were warped, some stuck together from moisture. I flipped through. Most were blank. Then I reached the last few pages. Scrawled in shaky handwriting. Asterisk, I don't know how long I've been here. The trail doesn't end. It just keeps going. I tried turning around. Didn't work. If someone finds this, asterisk, the writing cut off. A long, jagged slash tore through the paper, as if the writer had pressed the pen too hard before stopping abruptly. I dropped the notebook. My breath came fast and shallow. This was a joke. It had to be. Some prank. But the pack was real. The torn straps were real. The words in the notebook were real. I grabbed my map, trying to steady my shaking hands. I needed to find a way out. I picked a direction and ran. The forest blurred around me. My legs ached. My lungs burned. I ran until I couldn't anymore, until I collapsed against a tree, gasping for air. Then I saw it. The backpack. The same one. Right where I had found it before. A wave of dizziness crashed over me. My stomach twisted. My vision blurred at the edges. I was back where I started. The path wasn't leading me out. It was keeping me in. The plan was simple. I wanted to take a solo hiking trip, something I had never done before but had always thought about. I had spent the last few years hiking with friends, but this time, I wanted the solitude, the silence, the challenge. I picked a trail in the Pacific Northwest, a long, winding path that cut through dense forests and led to a remote mountain ridge. The trail was well documented, not too dangerous, and had a few scattered campsites along the way. I arrived at the trailhead in the late morning. The parking lot was mostly empty, save for a few cars, probably belonging to other hikers who had already set out. The air was crisp, and the scent of damp earth and pine needles filled my lungs. The sky was overcast, a thick blanket of gray that made the towering trees seem even darker and taller. I checked my pack one last time: water, food, tent, sleeping bag, extra clothes, first aid kit, a knife, and my GPS. I had researched the trail thoroughly and knew there was no cell service once I got deep into the forest. That didn't bother me. I wanted to disconnect. I wanted the quiet. The first few miles were peaceful. The trees formed a dense canopy overhead, their branches swaying slightly in the breeze. The path was well-trodden, lined with damp leaves and exposed roots. Occasionally, I would hear the rustling of small animals scurrying away as I approached. Birds called out from unseen perches, their songs echoing through the trees. About 5 miles in, the trail began to ascend. The climb was slow but steady, and as I gained elevation, the air grew thinner and colder. I pulled my jacket tighter around me. The trees became more spaced out, allowing more light to filter through, but the overcast sky kept everything in muted tones of gray and green. By late afternoon, I reached the first campsite. It was a small clearing with a fire pit and a fallen log that served as a makeshift bench. There were no signs of recent visitors. I set my pack down and stretched my legs. My muscles ached, but it was a good kind of ache, the kind that came from pushing my body, from exerting myself. After setting up my tent and gathering some firewood, I sat by the fire and ate my dinner, a simple meal of dehydrated food and a protein bar. As the fire crackled, I stared into the flames, letting my mind wander. The silence was thick out here, only interrupted by the occasional rustling of the wind through the trees. As darkness fell, I crawled into my tent and zipped myself inside my sleeping bag. The forest around me felt vast, endless. I listened to the distant hoots of an owl and the occasional snap of a twig. It was eerie, but not unsettling. I had camped before. I knew these sounds. I told myself it was just the forest being alive, moving, shifting. I must have drifted off because I woke up to something, a sound. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, but as I blinked myself awake, I heard it again. A crunching noise, footsteps. I held my breath, heart hammering in my chest. It was faint, slow, deliberate. Not the scurrying of an animal, not the rustling of leaves in the wind. These were footsteps. I sat up slowly, careful not to make noise. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly in my hand. I strained my ears, listening. The sound had stopped. Nothing but the wind, the distant creak of tree branches. Minutes passed. I stayed still, barely breathing. Maybe it had been my imagination. Maybe I had been half asleep and dreamed it. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I lay back down, still clutching the knife. I told myself I was being paranoid. I had read stories about solo hikers letting their minds play tricks on them. The isolation, the darkness, it could make anything seem sinister. By morning, the fear felt silly. The sun had barely risen, casting a weak glow through the trees. I packed up my things quickly, eager to keep moving. The plan was to hike another 10 miles to the next campsite, a more secluded spot near a mountain lake. The day passed uneventfully. I walked, I climbed, I took in the scenery, but the feeling never fully left me. That uneasy feeling of being watched, of something just beyond my field of vision. By the time I reached the second campsite, the wind had picked up. The trees swayed violently, their branches creaking, groaning. I set up my tent quickly, my fingers numb from the cold. The lake was dark, still. I had imagined it would be peaceful, beautiful, but now it looked ominous, like a sheet of black glass stretching into nothingness. That night, I woke up again. This time, I didn't hear footsteps. I heard breathing, slow, ragged, right outside my tent. Every muscle in my body tensed. My mind raced. It wasn't an animal. Animals didn't breathe like that. It was human. I clenched my knife. My mouth was dry. I wanted to call out, to scare them away, but fear paralyzed me. The breathing continued for what felt like forever. I could hear the fabric of my tent shifting slightly, as if something or someone was brushing against it. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Silence. Nothing. I stayed awake the rest of the night, barely moving, barely breathing. By dawn, I packed up in record time. I didn't eat. I didn't linger. I just walked, pushing myself harder than ever. My legs ached. My lungs burned, but I didn't care. I needed to get back. The hike back was grueling. Every sound made my heart leap. I felt exposed, vulnerable. I half expected to see someone lurking in the trees, watching, waiting, but I never did. By the time I reached the parking lot, I felt like I had been holding my breath for hours. I practically threw my gear into my car and locked the doors. As I sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel, I let out a long, shaky breath. I told myself I had imagined it, that isolation had played tricks on my mind. But as I started the car, I glanced at the trailhead, and my stomach dropped. There, nailed to the wooden post where trail maps were usually pinned, was something new. A single piece of paper, written in thick, uneven letters. "You're lucky. I never went back." I had planned this hike for weeks. The trail was deep in the woods, a lesser-known route in a national forest that promised solitude and stunning scenery. It was exactly what I wanted. Time alone, away from work, people, and the constant hum of daily life. I packed everything carefully. A tent, a sleeping bag, food, water, a map, and a GPS. I knew the risks of hiking alone, but I wasn't worried. I was experienced, and I had done this before. The drive to the trailhead was long, mostly winding roads through dense trees, the kind that made you feel like the rest of the world didn't exist. When I finally arrived, the parking lot was empty. That didn't bother me. I wanted to be alone. I stepped out, stretched, and took a deep breath of the cool forest air before shouldering my pack and locking my car. The trail started easy, a soft dirt path winding through tall pines. Birds called above, and sunlight filtered through the branches, casting shifting patterns on the ground. My boots crunched against the dirt and fallen leaves. The trail was marked, but not well traveled. I had to stop a few times to check my map, making sure I was on the right track. After a few miles, the trail narrowed and the trees thickened. The air felt heavier. I didn't think much of it. Forests could do that, becoming dense enough to block out the wind. I kept walking, following the path as it climbed steadily uphill. My legs burned, but it felt good. I liked pushing myself. The silence became more noticeable. There were no birds now, no rustling leaves, just my own breathing and the sound of my footsteps. I reached a clearing in the late afternoon, a perfect place to set up camp. A flat patch of earth sat near a small stream, surrounded by towering trees. I dropped my pack and stretched, feeling the weight lift off my shoulders. I set up my tent quickly, then gathered some wood for a small fire. The sky was dimming, turning from blue to deep orange. I sat by the fire, eating a protein bar, watching the flames flicker. The forest was silent. I tried to shake the uneasy feeling creeping into my chest. Silence wasn't unnatural, but it felt wrong. Usually you could hear insects, wind, distant animal calls. But there was nothing, just the crackling fire and my own movements. I told myself I was overthinking it. I was alone, miles from civilization. Of course, it was quiet. As the night deepened, I crawled into my tent, zipping myself inside. My body was tired, but my mind was restless. I listened, waiting for some normal sound of the forest, but the silence held. At some point, I drifted into an uneasy sleep. I woke up suddenly. I wasn't sure why. There was no sound, no movement, but I was alert, my heart hammering in my chest. I listened. Nothing. Just silence. I reached for my watch. 3:12 a.m. Then I heard it. A single snap of a twig. It wasn't far. My breath caught in my throat. I listened, every muscle in my body frozen. Another snap, closer. Something was moving outside my tent. Not an animal. Animals moved constantly, rustling leaves, breaking twigs. This was slow, deliberate. I stayed still. My tent was zipped. My knife was in my pack, just outside the tent. My heartbeat was so loud I thought it would give me away. Then the breathing started. Soft, slow breaths, just beyond the thin fabric of my tent. I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. This wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. Someone was out there, standing just feet away from me. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The breathing stayed for what felt like an eternity. Then finally it stopped. The footsteps moved away, slow, steady. I waited. Minutes passed. Maybe an hour. I didn't know. I didn't sleep. When the first light of dawn touched the trees, I unzipped my tent as quietly as possible, my fingers shaking. The fire was nothing but cold ash. My pack was still there. Everything looked untouched. But I wasn't alone. Someone had been here. Someone had stood outside my tent, listening to me sleep. I packed up fast, my hands unsteady. I kept my knife in my hand as I hiked back, moving quickly. Every snap of a branch, every shift of the trees made my heart pound. I kept looking over my shoulder. I didn't see anyone, but I could feel them. When I finally reached my car, I almost cried with relief. The parking lot was still empty. I threw my pack inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled out, I glanced in my rearview mirror, scanning the tree line. I swear I saw something move. I parked my truck at the edge of a narrow dirt lot, the only vehicle there. The trailhead was marked by an old wooden sign, its paint faded and cracked from years of sun and rain. Beyond it, the path wound into the dense forest, a thick wall of pine and oak swallowing the light. It was late afternoon, later than I had planned to start, but I had been itching for this trip all week. A solo hike, just me and the wilderness. The air smelled like damp earth and pine needles. I tightened my backpack straps, adjusted my water bottle, and stepped onto the trail. The first stretch was easy, flat, well-worn, lined with fallen leaves and scattered rocks. Birds called out from the trees, their songs breaking up the quiet. I kept a steady pace, breathing deep, feeling my body settle into the rhythm of the hike. After about a mile, the trail began to climb. The incline wasn't steep, but it was constant. My thighs burned a little, my breath came harder. I welcomed it. The sweat, the ache in my muscles, it all made me feel alive. The trees grew thicker the farther I went, blocking out more of the light. The shadows stretched long across the path, but I wasn't worried. I had a flashlight and enough supplies if I had to spend the night. About 2 miles in, I reached a fork. I pulled out my map. The left path was the one I had planned to take, a longer but safer route that looped back to the parking lot. The right path was an old fire road, barely maintained. I knew it led to a ridgeline with a view I had wanted to see. It would add a couple of miles, but I had time. I chose the right. The path was narrower, the dirt loose under my boots. I kept going, enjoying the quiet. I saw no footprints, no signs of other hikers. A fresh trail, untouched. Felt good. Then, about 30 minutes in, I noticed something. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just my footsteps, my breathing, the occasional creak of a tree shifting in the wind. I stopped and listened. Nothing, not even the distant hum of insects. A deep, pressing silence. I told myself it was fine. Maybe the wildlife had moved elsewhere. I pushed forward. The trail was steeper here, winding up the side of the ridge. Rocks jutted out of the dirt, forcing me to watch my step. My legs burned, my back ached. I adjusted my pack and kept going. Then I saw the footprints. At first, they were faint, just impressions in the dry dirt. Then they became clearer. A pair of boot prints, deep like mine, but older, edges crumbling. They followed the path ahead, disappearing around a bend. I wasn't alone. I should have felt relieved, but instead, a strange unease settled in my chest. I hadn't passed anyone, and these prints didn't look fresh. How long had they been here? Who had made them? I shook off the feeling and kept moving. The prints continued, sometimes fading, sometimes reappearing. The trail leveled out at the top of the ridge, opening up to a breathtaking view. The valley stretched below, the sun dipping toward the horizon, casting everything in gold. I took a deep breath, letting the moment settle me. Then I saw it. Ahead, near the edge of the trail, something lay in the dirt. A backpack, half-zipped, faded red. Torn at the bottom, one strap broken. Beside it, a boot, worn down, covered in dried mud. No person. I scanned the area, my pulse picking up. The trees here were sparse, nothing but rocks and scrub past the trail. I stepped closer, my boot crunching on dry dirt. The bag had been here a while, a year, maybe more. Sun-bleached, weather-worn. I crouched and touched the fabric. Stiff, cold. I checked inside. Clothes. A water bottle half full. A map, edges curled. A wallet. I opened it. The ID inside was faded, but I could still make out the name. A man in his late 20s. Something moved behind me. I spun around, heart hammering. The trees swayed slightly in the breeze, branches creaking. Nothing else. Just the silence pressing down on me. I told myself it was the wind, but my gut said otherwise. I stood slowly, forcing my breath steady. I needed to leave. I turned back the way I came, walking fast, trying not to run. The sun was lower now, the shadows stretching long. My footsteps sounded too loud, too sharp. I kept glancing over my shoulder. The silence had deepened, thick as fog. Then I heard it. A crunch. Not mine. Close. I stopped, listened, my own breath too loud in my ears. Another step. Behind me. I turned fast, scanning the trees. Nothing. Just branches shifting, the breeze picking up. My skin prickled. I started walking again, faster. My boots hit the dirt hard, my breath shallow. I kept checking over my shoulder. The feeling of being watched dug into my spine. The footprints, the abandoned bag, the silence. I was not alone. I reached the fork in the trail and took the left path without thinking, my body moving on instinct, the safer route, the one I should have taken in the first place. I walked fast, my legs burning. The trees thickened, closing in. Every sound made me flinch. The air felt wrong, heavy, pressing in on me. Then, finally, I saw the break in the trees. The dirt lot, my truck. I didn't stop. I didn't turn around. I reached the door, yanked it open, and threw myself inside. I locked the doors, started the engine. As I pulled away, I looked back once. Just trees, just shadows. But deep in the woods, where the trail curved out of sight, something stood between the trees. Still, watching. I didn't slow down. I didn't stop. I just drove. I never went back. I had been planning this trip for months. A solo hike deep into the heart of the wilderness, away from the noise of the world. I picked a remote trail in the Pacific Northwest, a rugged stretch of land that cut through thick forests, steep ridges, and narrow valleys. The reports said it was rarely traveled, and that was exactly what I wanted. Just me, the trees, and the silence. I arrived at the trailhead early in the morning, the air crisp and cool. My pack was loaded with everything I needed. Enough food for several days, a sturdy tent, a first aid kit, and extra layers in case the weather turned. I had double-checked my map and GPS, made sure my emergency beacon was fully charged. I wasn't reckless. I had experience and I knew how to be prepared. The first day went smoothly. The trail wound through towering evergreens, the damp earth soft under my boots. Birds called from somewhere in the canopy, and the scent of pine was thick in the air. I hiked steadily, stopping only for water breaks and to snap a few photos of the breathtaking views. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, I found a small clearing by a slow-moving creek and set up camp. My tent went up without trouble, and after a quick meal, I sat outside, listening to the quiet sounds of the forest. I felt at peace. The second day was harder. The terrain grew steeper, the trail narrower. The trees closed in, their trunks thick and gnarled, their roots snaking across the path like traps waiting to be tripped. I moved carefully, using my trekking poles to keep steady on the uneven ground. Around midday, I noticed something strange. The forest had gone silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my own footsteps. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was normal, but the quiet pressed down on me, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. That night, I camped on a small plateau overlooking the valley below. The sky was clear, the stars burning bright above me. But sleep didn't come easy. I kept waking up, my heart hammering for no reason. Each time I sat up, the forest was the same. Dark, motionless, silent. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew something felt off. On the third day, things got worse. I started noticing things that made my stomach twist. A tree with deep, fresh gashes in the bark. Claw marks, maybe, though they were too high up for a bear. A pile of bones picked clean, lying right in the middle of the trail. A faint smell, something rotten, carried on the wind. I gripped my knife tighter as I walked, my senses on high alert. Then I found the footprints. They were human, but wrong, too large, too wide. The toes splayed out like a barefoot runner's. And they were fresh. I wasn't alone out here. I tried to stay calm, but my instincts screamed at me to leave. I checked my GPS, calculating the fastest way back to the trailhead. 2 days of hard hiking if I pushed myself. I could make it. I turned back the way I came, my pace quickening, my heart pounding against my ribs. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I set up camp in a dense thicket, my tent hidden among the trees. I kept my knife close, listening for any sound. Sometime past midnight, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving just beyond the edge of my campsite. I held my breath, my grip tightening on the knife. The footsteps circled, stopping, starting again, moving closer. I stayed frozen, praying whoever, whatever it was would go away. After what felt like hours, the sounds faded, but I knew it was still out there. At first light, I broke camp and started moving. Fast. My legs ached, my lungs burned, but I didn't stop. The footprints were everywhere now, crossing over the trail, sometimes disappearing into the underbrush only to reappear further ahead. It knew where I was going. It was following me. Midday, I reached a ravine I had crossed earlier in the trip. The makeshift bridge of fallen logs I had used was gone. Not broken, not washed away, gone. As if someone had dragged it away. My stomach dropped. I had to find another way across. I scoured the area, finally finding a narrow section where I could jump. It was risky, but I didn't have a choice. I threw my pack across first, then took a deep breath and leapt. I barely made it, my hands scrambling for purchase on the opposite ledge. I hauled myself up, my breath coming in ragged gasps. That night, I didn't set up my tent. I climbed a tree instead, wedging myself between the branches, forcing myself to stay awake. The moon was bright, casting long shadows through the trees. Then I saw it, a figure, standing on the trail below, too far to make out details, but close enough to know it was watching me. Just standing there, not moving, not making a sound. I don't know how long I stayed like that, my body frozen, my mind racing. At some point, exhaustion won. I must have drifted off because when I opened my eyes, the figure was gone. But the footprints beneath my tree were fresh. I moved before dawn, pushing my body past its limits. Every muscle screamed, but I didn't stop. I didn't eat.
He barely drank.
I just ran, crashing through the underbrush, ignoring the pain in my legs, the burning in my chest. I didn't care about the trail anymore, I just wanted out. By late afternoon, I saw something that nearly brought me to my knees, a road. The dirt access road that led back to the trailhead. Safety. I stumbled onto it, my vision swimming. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Behind me. Running. I didn't look back. I ran. Harder than I ever had in my life. The parking lot came into view. My car a beacon of salvation. I fumbled for my keys, throwing myself into the driver's seat, slamming the doors, locking them. My hands shook as I started the engine. The headlights illuminated the empty road ahead. I didn't wait. I didn't breathe. I just drove. I didn't stop until I was hours away, back in the safety of civilization. I sat in a gas station parking lot, hands still trembling on the wheel, trying to make sense of what had happened. But I knew one thing for certain. Something was out there, and it had been hunting me. I started the hike alone like I always did. It wasn't about proving anything, I just liked the solitude. The sound of my boots on dirt, the crunch of twigs beneath my feet, the smell of damp earth and pine. It was all better without conversation. This trail, in particular, was one I'd had my eyes on for a while. It wasn't well-traveled, which was exactly why it appealed to me. The fewer people, the better. The day was bright, but the forest was dense, and the trees swallowed most of the sunlight before it could reach the ground. The first few miles were easy. Just me, the trail, and the occasional sound of a bird overhead. Every now and then, I checked my map. The path wasn't marked well, but I had a GPS tracker and a printed map as a backup. It was around mile 6 when I started noticing things were a little off. Not wrong exactly, just different. The trees grew tighter together. The air felt heavier. I checked the time. Just after noon. I should have had plenty of daylight left, but for some reason, it already felt later. A few minutes later, I saw the first sign that something wasn't right. There was a pile of sticks just off the trail. At first, I thought it was just a random collection, but it was arranged too neatly, stacked deliberately. I stopped, looked at it for a second, then shook it off and kept going. A mile later, I found another one. Same size, same deliberate stacking. My stomach tightened a little. It wasn't exactly strange. Some people build little structures in the woods, but something about it made me uneasy. I pushed forward, brushing off the feeling. I wasn't superstitious, and I wasn't about to let some weird pile of sticks turn me around. The trail was growing steeper now, more rugged. The incline forced me to slow down, and I realized the air had gone still. No wind, no birds, just the sound of my own footsteps and my breathing. It was around mile 8 when I saw the footprints. They weren't mine. They were fresh, too fresh. The dirt was still slightly crumbled at the edges, not yet settled. They weren't boot prints like mine either, bare feet, deep enough to belong to someone heavier than me. I stopped walking, looked around. Nothing. No movement, no sound. The woods stretched out in every direction, dense and unyielding. I wasn't afraid yet, but I was alert now. I kept walking, slowly, checking the ground more often. The footprints continued, always just ahead, never turning off the trail. Whoever they belonged to was walking the same path I was, but I hadn't seen anyone. Another mile passed. My chest felt tight. Then I smelled it, something rotten. At first, I thought it was just some dead animal nearby, maybe a deer that had been downed by a predator. But the smell didn't fade. It got worse. Thick, suffocating, like meat left in the sun for days. I pulled my shirt up over my nose, swallowing back the urge to gag. That's when I saw it. A torn piece of cloth, snagged on a low branch, faded, dirty, and unmistakably human. I stood still for a long moment, listening, scanning the trees. Nothing. I wasn't about to jump to conclusions, but my instincts were screaming now. I checked my GPS. The trail looped back in another 5 miles. If I turned back, I'd still have to hike 8 miles to get out. It was faster to keep going. I picked up the pace. My body was tense, every sound making my muscles tighten. Every so often, I glanced over my shoulder, and then I saw him, far back on the trail. Too far to make out details, but close enough that I knew it was a person. standing still, watching. A chill ran through my whole body. My first instinct was to call out, but something deep inside told me not to. Instead, I just walked faster, keeping my pace controlled. I checked again a few minutes later. He was closer, still standing still, still watching. The panic set in now, creeping up my spine. I wasn't armed, just a small knife, nothing that would do much if this guy decided to come after me. I kept going. The trail started to narrow, and the trees grew even closer. The footprints were gone now, but I didn't care. My whole focus was on the feeling creeping up my neck, that undeniable sense of being hunted. I didn't look back again. I just ran.
Branches tore at my arms, my legs.
The uneven ground made me stumble, but I didn't stop. My lungs burned. My thighs screamed, but I didn't stop. The trail blurred under me, and for a moment, I lost track of where I was. My foot caught on a root, and I hit the ground hard. The wind knocked from my chest. I rolled onto my back, gasping, and my eyes snapped to the trail behind me. Empty. No one there. No movement. Nothing. For a long moment, I lay there, listening to my own ragged breathing. My mind was spinning. Had I imagined it? Had I overreacted? No, someone was there. I knew it. I scrambled to my feet, forcing myself to keep moving. Every step felt heavier now. My body ached, but the fear kept me moving. Then, finally, I saw the break in the trees. The parking lot. My car. I didn't stop running until I reached it, yanking the door open, slamming it shut, locking it. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. My breath came in short, ragged gasps as I stared at the tree line. Nothing. No one. I peeled out of the lot, not stopping until I was miles away. I never reported it. Never told anyone. Who would believe me? There was no crime, no proof. Just a feeling. Just footprints. Just a man I never really saw. But I never hiked alone again. I had been hiking for years, but this trail was different. It was remote, barely known, and the kind of place that didn't show up on popular hiking forums. It had taken me weeks to track down information about it. An old logging road turned into a backwoods trail, mostly overgrown, with no recent reviews or updates. That was exactly what I wanted. I liked the solitude, the challenge. I didn't want groomed paths or crowds of weekend hikers. I wanted to be out there alone, listening to nothing but the sound of my boots crunching dirt and the wind moving through the trees. The drive out took longer than I expected. The road narrowed to little more than 2 muddy ruts, lined by thick trees on both sides. I had to stop twice to move fallen branches out of the way. My old truck groaned as it crawled over the rough terrain, but eventually, I reached a small pull-off where I could park. The trailhead wasn't marked, but I had my map, my GPS, and my compass. I double-checked my gear, tent, sleeping bag, enough food and water for 3 days, a knife, my first aid kit. Everything was in order. I slung my pack onto my shoulders, locked the truck, and stepped into the woods. First, it was perfect. The trees were dense, but the trail was just visible enough. A few times, I had to stop and double-check my route, but I never felt lost. The sun was high, and despite the thick canopy overhead, there was enough light to see clearly. The air was crisp, cool for the season, and the forest smelled rich, earthy, damp, alive. I walked for hours, moving deeper into the wilderness. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. No distant sounds of cars, no airplanes overhead. Just the wind and the occasional snap of a branch under my feet. By late afternoon, I found a decent clearing near a slow-moving stream. It was a good place to camp. Flat ground, a water source, enough space to set up my tent without being completely exposed. I dropped my pack and stretched, rolling the stiffness out of my shoulders. Everything was going according to plan, but something felt off. It wasn't obvious at first, just small things. The way the wind died down too quickly, as if the air itself was holding its breath. The way the trees around my campsite seemed darker than the ones I had passed earlier. I told myself it was just my imagination. I had been hiking alone plenty of times before, and the mind had a way of playing tricks on you when you were isolated. I set up my tent, gathered some wood for a small fire, and boiled water for my freeze-dried meal. As I ate, I kept glancing around, scanning the trees. There was nothing out there. No animals rustling in the underbrush, no birds flitting between branches, just silence. That night, I barely slept. I woke up every hour, ears straining in the dark. I wasn't sure what I was listening for, but the silence wasn't right. It was the kind of silence that felt unnatural, forced. At one point, I thought I heard something, a faint, rhythmic sound, like breathing just outside my tent. I held my breath, knife gripped tight in my hand, but it never got closer, and eventually, I must have drifted off. The next morning, I shook it off. It was just nerves, just my brain reacting to the isolation. I packed up my gear and continued deeper into the forest. The trail grew harder to follow. The undergrowth thickened, and several times I had to backtrack to find the path again. My map told me I was heading in the right direction, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being herded, like the forest itself was guiding me somewhere, narrowing my choices until there was only one way to go. By mid-afternoon, I found another clearing and decided to rest. As I set my pack down, I noticed something strange. The ground here was different, loose, disturbed. At first, I thought it was just an animal burrow, but the more I looked, the more I realized the earth had been dug up. Recently, I crouched down and ran my fingers through the soil. It was soft, too soft. I grabbed a stick and poked at the ground. It sank deeper than it should have. My stomach tightened. I shouldn't have dug. I know that now, but I did. I scraped at the dirt, pushing it aside, uncovering something buried just beneath the surface. Fabric. Dark, rotting fabric, tangled in the roots of the trees. I swallowed hard and pulled at it, feeling the weight of something beneath. My mind screamed at me to stop, but my hands kept moving, uncovering more, revealing something wrapped tightly, something that smelled like damp decay. And then I saw it. A hand, small, skeletal. I stumbled back, my heart hammering. My breath came in short, shallow gasps. My first instinct was to run, but my body refused to move. Someone had buried this here, and it wasn't old, not old enough to be some long-forgotten grave. The fabric was too new, the soil too freshly turned. I forced myself to stand, to think. I needed to leave. Now, I grabbed my pack and turned, but something caught my eye. A boot print, not mine, deep in the dirt, leading away from the grave, leading toward me. I ran. I didn't care about the trail, about my route, about anything except getting away.
Branches toeren at my arms, my legs.
My breath burned in my chest. I ran until my legs threatened to give out, until I couldn't hear anything but the pounding of my own heart. And then I stopped, not because I wanted to, but because I saw something ahead. Another clearing, another patch of disturbed earth. There were more, dozens of them. I wasn't supposed to be here. I wasn't supposed to see this, and someone knew I had. The wind picked up, and for the first time, I heard something besides my own ragged breathing. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, close. I didn't wait to see who or what was coming. I turned and ran harder than I ever had in my life, crashing through the forest, lungs on fire, vision blurred. I don't know how I found the trail, how I made it back to my truck, but somehow I did. I fumbled with my keys, threw myself inside, and slammed the locks shut. My hands shook as I started the engine. My eyes locked on the trees. Nothing moved, but I knew someone was there, watching. I didn't stop driving until I hit the highway. I didn't sleep that night or the next, and I never went back. Some places aren't meant to be found. Some trails lead to things you can't unsee. And if you ever find yourself in a place where the silence is too deep, where the air feels wrong, where the ground looks like it's been disturbed, turn around and don't look back. I always loved hiking alone. It was my way of clearing my mind, of escaping the constant noise of everyday life. There was something about being deep in the woods, surrounded by nothing but trees and the sound of my own footsteps, that made me feel truly free. That weekend, I had planned a long solo hike through a stretch of national forest that wasn't too far from home. The trail wasn't one of the popular ones, which is exactly why I picked it. I wanted solitude. It was about 14 miles round trip, winding through thick forest, crossing a few streams, and leading to a ridge with a great view. I packed light, a small tent, enough food for a night, my knife, a flashlight, a lighter, and a simple first aid kit. I also carried a map and compass, even though I had hiked this area before. I parked my car at the small dirt lot near the trailhead around noon. There was only one other vehicle there, an old, dusty truck with a camper shell. I glanced at it for a second before shouldering my pack and heading into the woods. The first few miles were easy, mostly flat with some gentle inclines. The weather was perfect, cool but not cold, a light breeze whispering through the trees. A few miles in, I came across an old fire ring, the stones blackened with soot. It looked like someone had camped there recently, but there were no signs of trash or anything left behind. I took a short break, sipped some water, and kept going. The forest grew denser as I hiked deeper. The canopy overhead blocked out most of the sunlight, making it feel later in the day than it really was. The trail narrowed, winding between thick trunks, some of them charred from an old wildfire. By late afternoon, I reached the halfway point. I had planned to camp near a small stream that cut through the valley below the ridge. As I descended, I noticed the woods felt different. It wasn't anything obvious, just a feeling. Maybe it was the way the trees grew closer together, or the way the underbrush seemed untouched, like no one had walked through here in a long time. I pushed the thought aside. When I reached the stream, I found a flat spot a little ways off the trail to set up camp. The water was clear, moving fast over smooth stones. I pitched my tent, gathered some wood, and started a small fire as the sun dipped behind the trees. The air cooled quickly. I ate my dinner, just some jerky and a protein bar, and sat by the fire, enjoying the quiet. Then I heard it. A branch snapping somewhere behind me. I turned, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. Could have been an animal, a deer maybe. I listened for a while, but everything was still. The fire crackled softly. I told myself it was nothing. I stayed up a little longer, watching the flames. The forest was dark now, the only light coming from my fire and the faint glow of the moon through the trees. I eventually crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and laid down. Took me a while to fall asleep. The ground was cold, and every little sound outside made me tense. I reminded myself that I was alone out here. No one even knew I was here. That thought wasn't comforting. I woke up sometime in the night. I wasn't sure why at first. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not an animal. Too heavy. Slow, deliberate. I held my breath. The fire had burned low, but I could still see faint orange light flickering against the walls of my tent. The footsteps stopped. I listened, heart pounding. Silence. Then, just outside my tent, I heard breathing. Low, steady breathing. I reached for my knife. My hand was shaking. I stayed completely still, barely even breathing myself. The breathing outside didn't stop. It wasn't loud, but it was close. Someone was standing right outside my tent. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I wanted to run. But where? I was alone, miles from anyone. Minutes passed. The breathing faded. Then, footsteps. Slow, moving away. Then nothing. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, gripping my knife so tightly my hand hurt. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just laid there, listening, waiting. At first light, I unzipped my tent slowly, knife in hand, and peeked outside. The forest was empty. The fire had burned to embers. I looked around, but saw nothing. No footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. But I knew what I heard. I packed up my camp in record time. I wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. As I climbed back up toward the ridge, I kept looking over my shoulder. The forest felt different now, wrong somehow. A few miles from the car, I saw something that made my stomach drop. On a tree just off the trail was a single piece of rope tied into a loop. A noose. It hadn't been there yesterday. I walked faster. My legs ached, My pack felt heavier, but I didn't stop. I just needed to get to my car. When I finally broke through the tree line into the parking lot, I almost cried. My car was still there, but so was the old truck. Empty. I didn't waste time. I threw my pack in the car and got in, locking the doors. As I started the engine, I looked at the truck again. Something about it felt wrong. I glanced at the rearview mirror before pulling out of the lot, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, half hidden in the shadows. Watching me, I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I drove until I was far, far away. I never hiked alone again. The trail started off easy. It was just dirt, packed down from years of boots, bikes, and animal tracks. A little steep in places, but nothing I hadn't handled before. The trees were thick, tall pines stretching high above, their branches swaying with the wind. Every so often, the sunlight broke through, hitting the ground in golden patches. Felt good at first, peaceful. I had planned this hike for weeks. I wanted to go alone, just me, my pack, and miles of quiet. The forest had always been my escape. No cell service, no distractions, no people, just me and the trail. It was supposed to be a simple 3-day trek through a remote section of national forest. I had a GPS, a map, plenty of food and water. I wasn't an amateur. I knew what I was doing. The first few miles went by quickly. I kept a steady pace, taking in the clean air, the smell of pine and damp earth. Birds called from somewhere in the canopy. The wind whistled through the trees. It was the kind of silence I loved, the kind that made the world feel big and empty, but in a comforting way. By late afternoon, I reached a small clearing and decided to set up camp. I dropped my pack, stretched, and started unpacking. The spot was perfect: flat ground, soft pine needles, and a decent view of the valley below. I set up my tent, ate a quick meal, and watched the sun sink below the treeline. As the sky darkened, the temperature dropped fast. I crawled into my sleeping bag, listening to the forest settle into night. That's when I first noticed it. The silence. No wind, no insects, no rustling branches. It was like the whole forest had gone still at once. My ears strained, expecting to hear an owl, a coyote, something, but there was nothing. I tried to brush it off. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe the wind had just died down, and the cold had sent the animals into hiding. It made sense, but that feeling, that uneasy, skin-crawling feeling, didn't go away. I shifted in my sleeping bag, trying to shake the nerves. I closed my eyes, listening hard, waiting for the forest to sound normal again. And then, finally, I heard something. A single twig snapping. Not close, but not far either. I sat up, my breath caught in my throat. My hand moved to my knife just in case. I listened, waiting for more, but nothing came. Just that one snap and then silence again. I told myself it was an animal. A deer, maybe. A raccoon. Something harmless. But my gut said otherwise. The sound had been deliberate, one step, like something testing the ground. I stayed awake for hours listening, waiting, but nothing else happened. Eventually, exhaustion won. I lay back down, forcing my eyes shut, and drifted off into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, everything seemed normal again. The birds were back, the wind moved through the trees, and the forest felt alive. I packed up and pushed on, convincing myself I had overreacted. But as I hiked, that feeling of unease never really left. By midday, the trail had grown rougher. The trees were denser, the ground more uneven. I checked my map, my GPS, and kept moving. I was deep in the forest now, miles away from the nearest road. That's what I wanted. That was the plan. But for the first time, I wished I wasn't alone. Something felt wrong. And then I saw it. A footprint. Not mine. It was fresh, pressed into the damp earth, half covered by fallen leaves. A boot print large, wider than mine, and heading in the same direction I was going. My stomach tightened. I hadn't seen anyone all day. No signs of another hiker. No voices. No distant movement. And yet, Here was proof that someone had been through here recently. I stood there, staring at the print, my mind running through possibilities. A hunter? Another backpacker? It wasn't unusual for people to be out here, but something about it put me on edge. The way the print was placed, just one, like someone had stepped, then carefully moved away. I kept walking. For the next few hours, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every few minutes, I'd glance over my shoulder, scanning the trees. Nothing, just endless trunks and branches, stretching in all directions. By late afternoon, I knew I needed to find a place to camp. My legs were sore, my back ached, and my nerves were fried. I found a small, sheltered spot beneath a rock overhang and set up for the night. As I unpacked, I kept checking my surroundings. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the underbrush made my skin crawl. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd jolt awake, convinced I had heard something. A branch moving, footsteps, breathing. But each time when I sat up and listened, there was nothing. At some point, exhaustion took over again. I must have drifted off because I woke to the sound of something moving outside my tent. Slow, careful. My heart pounded. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I listened as whatever it was circled my campsite, the soft crunch of leaves barely audible. I reached for my knife, gripping it so tightly my fingers ached. I wanted to unzip the tent, to look, to see what was out there, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. I stayed awake until dawn. As soon as the sky lightened, I packed up. I didn't eat. I didn't stop to rest. I just moved, fast. My only goal was to get out. By noon, I recognized part of the trail. I was close to the main road, maybe another 2 hours. I forced myself to keep going, even when my legs screamed at me to stop. And then, up ahead, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Another footprint, fresh, this time facing the opposite direction. Whoever had been following me had turned back. I didn't stop. I didn't think. I just ran. My pack bounced against my back. My lungs burned, but I didn't care. I didn't slow down until I reached my car. I fumbled with the keys, throwing my pack in, slamming the door shut, locking it. I sat there, breathing hard, my hands shaking. Then, finally, I started the engine and drove. I never went back to that trail, and I never hiked alone again. I had been hiking alone for years, and I was no stranger to the isolation that came with deep woods and long trails. It was something I craved, something that gave me a kind of peace I couldn't find anywhere else. But I've never forgotten what happened on that last trip, the one that made me question everything I thought I knew about nature and my own instincts. I had planned a 3-day hike through a stretch of wilderness in Montana, a place where the trees were so thick they swallowed the sunlight, and the mountains stood like silent giants in the distance. It was late September, the air crisp, the leaves just beginning to turn. Perfect hiking weather. The trail I chose wasn't popular. That was the point. I wanted solitude. I had packed my gear carefully. Enough food, water, my knife, a small axe, a tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold temperatures, and my GPS. My pack was heavy, but I was used to it. I had a paper map too, just in case. People disappear in places like this, and I wasn't going to be one of them. The first day was uneventful. I made good time, covering nearly 15 miles before setting up camp near a small, clear stream. The night was quiet, except for the occasional rustling of small animals in the underbrush. I was too tired to let my mind play tricks on me, so I slept without trouble. The second day, I noticed something odd. A few miles into my hike, I saw what looked like claw marks on a tree trunk, not the kind left by a bear. These were long, deep, and parallel, too uniform to be from an animal scratching lazily. They looked deliberate. I ran my fingers over them, feeling the rough gouges. Maybe a hunter had made them, marking a path? But no, that didn't make sense. This trail wasn't used often, and the marks were fresh. The exposed would not yet darken by time or weather. I pushed on. By midday, I had the strange sense I wasn't alone. I kept turning around, expecting to see someone, but there was nothing. No movement, no sound beyond the usual wind through the trees and distant birdsong. Still, the feeling stuck with me, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. I had been alone in the woods plenty of times before, but I had never felt watched like this. I told myself I was just being paranoid. I kept moving. I planned to make camp near a small lake marked on my map. When I got there, the sun was starting to dip, casting long shadows over the water. It was beautiful, but something felt off. The place was too still. There were no animal tracks near the shoreline, no birds dipping into the water to catch fish, no insects buzzing above the surface. It was like everything had abandoned the area. Even the air felt heavier, thicker. I should have left. I should have trusted my gut. But I was tired, and I didn't want to backtrack to find another spot. So I set up my tent, built a small fire, and ate in silence. The unease didn't go away. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the trees, expecting to see something move just beyond the firelight. Nothing did. That night, I woke up suddenly. No sound had woken me, just that deep, primal instinct that something wasn't right. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow. My breath felt too loud in the silence. Then I heard it, a soft crunch, footsteps, not an animal. Animals move with an erratic rhythm. This was steady, careful, deliberate. I didn't move. I strained my ears, trying to track the sound. It was coming from the trees behind my tent. Then it stopped. I lay there, heart pounding, every muscle tensed. I didn't dare unzip my tent. I listened for what felt like hours, but there was nothing else. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been my imagination. Maybe a branch falling, maybe the wind shifting the trees. Morning came, and I stepped out of my tent, muscles sore from how tense I had been all night. I checked the ground around my campsite, but I didn't see any tracks. I almost convinced myself I had overreacted. Almost. I decided to cut my trip short. I didn't feel right out here anymore. I packed up quickly and started back the way I came, moving faster than I normally would. I wasn't running, but I wasn't taking my time either. The whole hike back, I felt like something was just behind me, just out of sight. The woods felt different. I made it back to my car before dark, throwing my pack in the back seat and locking the doors as soon as I got inside. Only then did I let out a breath, my body finally relaxing. I told myself I had spooked myself over nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been lucky to leave when I did. 2 weeks later, I was scrolling through local news reports when I saw a small story about a missing person. A hiker, gone without a trace in the same stretch of woods. No signs of struggle, no evidence left behind. I don't know what I encountered out there. I don't know if it was a person or something else. But I do know one thing: I won't be going back to find out.